The cleaning lady pointed at the framed photograph on my kitchen island and quietly asked if the man in the picture was really my husband. When I told her he was, she slid her cracked smartphone across the cold marble. She showed me a video I was never meant to see. What I saw on that tiny screen was undeniably bad, but what I heard was a masterclass in financial treason. My husband thought he was executing a brilliant game of chess against a helpless opponent. He did not realize I owned the entire board. The Seattle rain was relentless that Tuesday morning, drumming a steady rhythm against the floor-to-ceiling windows of my kitchen. I was pouring my second cup of black coffee when Rosa arrived unannounced. Rosa was the woman hired to clean Richard's downtown corporate condo twice a week. We rarely crossed paths since I preferred the quiet of our Mercer Island home, but today she stood in my kitchen dripping wet. She clutched her phone tightly. Her hands were visibly shaking. She refused the warm mug of coffee I offered. Instead, she stared at the anniversary portrait on the counter. She swallowed hard before asking her question. I nodded and confirmed that yes, the man smiling in the photo was Richard. She unlocked her phone and pushed it toward me. The screen played a scene that would have completely destroyed a normal wife. It was the master bedroom of the downtown condo. The expensive sheets I had personally selected were tangled around my husband and his 26-year-old marketing director, Lexi. The visual was a pathetic cliché. A man trying to buy back his youth with a girl who barely knew how to read a basic balance sheet. She was clinging to him, laughing about something he had just whispered. But the video was not a silent film. Rosa had left her cleaning cart right outside the cracked bedroom door, and her phone had captured the audio with crystal clarity. Lexi giggled and asked Richard when he was finally going to cut me loose. She complained that my cheap consulting business was a total embarrassment to his corporate image. Richard laughed in response. It was a cruel and arrogant sound. He stroked her hair and told her she only needed to be patient until Friday. Then he delivered the exact words that legally sealed his absolute downfall. He told her the $4.2 million equity line clears tomorrow morning. He bragged that he had forged my signature on the guarantor forms late last night. He promised Lexi that by the time he handed me the divorce papers on Friday night, my little consulting limited liability company would be completely bankrupt, and the offshore account in the Cayman Islands would be completely untouchable. My pulse did not spike. My breathing did not change. I did not drop the phone or collapse onto the kitchen floor in a puddle of tears. I simply watched the video a second time to memorize the exact timestamp and the specific account details he casually mentioned to his mistress. $4.2 million. A forged signature. A Friday ambush. Richard assumed I was just a low-level freelance bookkeeper who spent her days organizing petty cash receipts for local businesses. He truly believed my consulting firm was a cute little hobby to keep me busy while he did the real work. He forgot the fundamental truth of who I was. He forgot that before I married him, I spent 8 grueling years as a lead forensic auditor for the Internal Revenue Service. I tracked hidden money for a living. I dismantled shell companies before breakfast. He routed the money through a shell company. I knew exactly which one because he used the same predictable naming conventions for everything. He was arrogant, but he was not creative. He assumed the bank would process the forged documents without a secondary verification because of his executive title at Vanguard Real Estate. He was banking on my supposed ignorance. He thought I would be too blinded by the shock of the divorce papers to demand an immediate audit of our joint assets. He thought his offshore strategy was bulletproof. Rosa watched my face closely, waiting for the tears to fall. She braced herself, expecting screams. She expected me to throw my coffee mug against the wall in a fit of hysterical rage. I did none of those things. I tapped her screen and securely airdropped the video file directly to my encrypted private server. Once the digital transfer was completely verified, I opened the banking application on my own phone. I asked Rosa for her phone number. She gave it to me hesitantly. Within 10 seconds, a bright notification popped up on her cracked screen. I had just wired her $5,000 through the digital application. Rosa gasped loudly and tried to push her phone back toward me across the island. She shook her head and said it was far too much money. Her daily rate for cleaning the condo was $150. I had just handed her more than a month of wages in a single second. She told me she just wanted me to know the truth because no woman deserved to be treated that way. I placed my hand firmly over hers to stop her movements. I needed her entirely compliant. I needed her to be a ghost in his apartment for the next 72 hours. I told her the money was not a gift or a token of appreciation. It was a strict business transaction. I looked her dead in the eyes and maintained a perfectly level voice. I told her this payment is for your absolute silence, Rosa. I instructed her to delete the video from her phone right in front of me. I told her she would go back to cleaning that downtown condo tomorrow as if she saw and heard absolutely nothing. I made it clear that if Richard asked her how her day was, she would smile and say good morning. Rosa looked at my calm expression and swallowed hard. She nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of the situation. She deleted the file from her camera roll and cleared her recently deleted folder while I watched. I thanked her for her services and showed her to the front door. As soon as the lock clicked shut behind her, I walked straight to my home office. Richard thought he was going to leave me with nothing but a worthless company and a broken heart. He thought Friday would be the day he won. I sat down at my desk and booted up my encrypted terminal. I had 3 days to ensure that when Friday arrived, Richard would lose everything he ever valued. The game had officially begun, and he had already handed me the winning hand. Richard's view of my career was predictably patronizing. He loved telling his colleagues at Vanguard Real Estate that his wife was a humble freelance bookkeeper. He would smile that condescending smile over expensive dinners and tell everyone that I helped local bakeries and boutique flower shops balance their daily ledgers. It fit his carefully crafted narrative perfectly. He was the high-powered commercial real estate executive making the real money, and I was the quiet, supportive wife dabbling in basic math just to feel useful. He completely blocked out the first decade of our relationship. Before I ever touched a freelance invoice for a local business, I spent 8 brutal years as a lead forensic auditor for the Internal Revenue Service. My job was not balancing petty cash for cupcakes. My job was dismantling international tax evasion rings and tracking dark money for the federal government. I hunted white-collar sociopaths who thought they were smarter than the system. I left the federal agency not because I was tired of the work, but because I realized the real power was in the private sector. That was exactly when I founded Apex Capital. Apex Capital is a private equity firm that operates entirely in the shadows. We are essentially a ghost firm. We do not have a flashy public website, a marketing department, or an executive office in a glass skyscraper. We exist purely on paper and in encrypted servers. We aggressively acquire distressed assets. We ruthlessly restructure corporate debt, and we quietly absorb vulnerable financial institutions. Richard thought I made roughly $60,000 a year from my home office. He did not know my firm actively managed over $9 billion in discrete corporate assets. He thought he was married to a sheep. He forgot he married the apex predator of the financial food chain. I sat down at my custom-built desk and placed my hands on the cool aluminum of my keyboard. I entered my 32-character alphanumeric passphrase. The biometric scanner built into the desk flashed green, reading my fingerprint, and my 3 encrypted monitors blinked to life. I bypassed my fake bookkeeping desktop environment, which I kept active just in case he ever looked over my shoulder. I initiated the secure tunneling protocol and accessed the Apex Capital mainframe. I needed to find exactly where Richard was hiding the $4.2 million. In the video, he explicitly mentioned an equity line and a forged guarantor form. He worked as a vice president for Vanguard Real Estate, which meant he was illegally leveraging commercial properties he managed but did not actually own. I accessed the Federal Commercial Real Estate Registry database and cross-referenced his executive authorization codes. Richard was incredibly arrogant, but he was also fundamentally sloppy. He always used his middle name combined with his birth year for his administrative passwords. Within 4 minutes, I was completely inside his private corporate drive at Vanguard. I found the financial file almost immediately. It was boldly labeled Project Oasis. Corporate narcissists always give their financial crimes cinematic names. I opened the digital document, and there it was in high definition. It was a massive commercial equity line of credit drawn directly against 3 luxury commercial properties Vanguard owned in downtown Seattle. And right there at the very bottom of the 4th page on the primary guarantor line was my signature. It was a digital forgery and a remarkably terrible one at that. He had clearly copied my signature from our joint tax return last year and pasted it onto the commercial lending agreement. He did not even bother to scrub the digital metadata from the portable document format file. The hidden document properties clearly showed the file was created and modified on his personal laptop at 11:45 last night. But a forged signature on a digital file was only the beginning of the trail. I needed to trace the actual capital pipeline. $4.2 million is not something you can just transfer into a standard personal checking account without immediately triggering a dozen federal banking flags. I pulled up the specific wire routing numbers attached to the Oasis file. He was initiating the massive cash transfer to a domestic shell company registered in the state of Delaware. Delaware is notorious for being a domestic tax haven that allows limited liability companies to operate with almost total anonymity. I accessed the Delaware State Corporate Registry through a secure backdoor portal I still maintained from my days at the Internal Revenue Service. The shell company was officially registered as Blue Haven Holdings. It was formally incorporated exactly 3 weeks ago. The registered agent was a generic post office box in Wilmington, but the associated recovery email address was registered to a virtual proxy server. I ran a standard deep trace on the proxy server routing and smiled coldly at the glowing screens. The Internet Protocol address bounced back directly to a luxury apartment complex downtown. It was Lexi's exact address. Richard was actively using his 26-year-old marketing director mistress as the primary digital fall guy for a multi-million-dollar federal embezzlement scheme. If the banking authorities ever investigated the missing funds, the digital footprint would point directly to her residential bedroom. He was deliberately setting her up to take the mandatory federal prison sentence just in case the plan collapsed while he escaped with the untraceable cash. It was brilliantly ruthless, but mathematically flawed because he left too many digital breadcrumbs. I continued to follow the money down the rabbit hole. I tracked the destination banking account where the Delaware Shell Company was preparing to receive the funds tomorrow morning before the planned offshore transfer to the Cayman Islands. Richard needed a specific type of bank to pull this off. He needed a bank that was large enough to routinely process a $4.2 million commercial wire without manually calling the guarantor to verify the transaction over the phone. But he also needed a bank that was small enough to lack advanced algorithmic fraud detection software. He chose Horizon Trust. Horizon Trust is a mid-tier regional bank headquartered in Portland, Oregon. They are well known in the financial sector for their old-fashioned banking methods, their notoriously archaic software systems, and their incredibly lenient commercial lending policies. It was the absolute perfect target for a desperate corporate executive looking to slip a fraudulent multi-million-dollar equity line past a sleepy compliance department. Richard must have spent weeks secretly researching the most technically vulnerable financial institution in the Pacific Northwest to successfully execute his theft. He truly thought he was a financial genius. He thought he had found the ultimate blind spot in the American banking system. But Richard did not read the quarterly financial acquisitions report published by the Securities and Exchange Commission. He only paid attention to real estate markets. If he had bothered to read the broader financial filings, he would have noticed a very minor regulatory filing from exactly 6 months ago. Horizon Trust had been quietly bleeding capital for 2 straight years due to terrible management. They were on the absolute verge of total corporate insolvency and a massive public collapse. To avoid a catastrophic public run on the bank, the board of directors authorized a silent and immediate buyout. 6 months ago, Horizon Trust was acquired in its entirety by a private equity ghost firm. They were bought in cash by Apex Capital. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather office chair and let out a single sharp laugh that echoed in the empty, silent room. My husband was actively committing felony wire fraud. He had maliciously forged my legal signature to financially ruin my life and bankrupt my supposed small business. He was attempting to funnel $4.2 million into an untouchable offshore account to fund his luxurious new life with his oblivious young mistress. But the bank he deliberately chose to steal from was my bank. He was literally using my own financial institution to process his fraudulent transaction. Every single bank teller, every regional branch manager, and every automated fraud detection server at Horizon Trust ultimately reported to me. He thought he was holding a loaded gun to my head and preparing to pull the trigger on Friday night. He did not realize he had just handed me the remote control to an explosive device strapped directly to his own chest. I did not need to hire an expensive divorce attorney to aggressively fight for my half of our assets. I did not need to cry and argue in a crowded family court over monthly alimony payments or the deed to the Mercer Island house. Richard had unknowingly stepped completely out of standard family law and walked directly into the realm of federal corporate crimes. The financial onion was completely peeled and the core was entirely rotten. All I had to do now was let him confidently execute the wire transfer tomorrow morning and then calmly lock the digital doors from the outside. I stared at the pending transaction blinking on my center monitor. The standard operating procedure for any bank executive discovering a fraudulent wire transfer is immediate cancellation. A single keystroke would have frozen the $4.2 million right there in the Vanguard real estate corporate accounts. I could have easily locked down the Horizon Trust receiving portal and generated an automated rejection notice to his employer. That is what a normal wife would do to protect her remaining marital assets. But I was no longer acting as a betrayed wife. I was acting as the apex predator he unknowingly invited into his financial ecosystem. If I simply blocked the transfer, Richard would immediately panic. He would realize someone was actively monitoring his accounts, and he would desperately look for another way to hide the money. He would cover his digital tracks and destroy the evidence. I needed him to feel completely victorious and completely secure. I needed his crime to cross the threshold from an attempted corporate fraud to a fully executed federal felony. My years at the Internal Revenue Service taught me one fundamental rule about catching arrogant men. You never interrupt them when they are actively destroying themselves. I bypassed the automated security hold on the pending transaction portal. I manually accessed the administrative override panel for the Horizon Trust backend servers. The screen prompted me for a secondary executive authorization code. I typed it in without a single second of hesitation. The status bar for the $4.2 million transfer instantly changed from pending verification to expedited processing. I was officially opening the digital gates to let the stolen money flow directly into the Delaware shell company. By manually authorizing the transfer, I was allowing him to complete the physical act of embezzlement. He had now officially crossed state lines digitally. He had utilized a federally insured institution to launder stolen corporate funds. He had committed severe wire fraud, identity theft, and corporate espionage all in one fell swoop. The federal minimum sentencing guidelines for the financial magnitude of his actions carried a mandatory 20-year prison term. The trap was flawlessly set, but a financial guillotine requires a brilliant legal executioner to drop the blade at the exact right moment. I picked up my phone and dialed my sister-in-law. The phone rang exactly twice before she answered. Jasmine was married to Richard's younger brother, Marcus. Whenever we attended family gatherings, Richard and his mother Sylvia would treat Jasmine with a sickening blend of blatant condescension and thinly veiled prejudice. Sylvia would loudly ask Jasmine how things were going at her little law firm and offer completely unsolicited advice on how to dress more professionally for corporate environments. Richard would constantly make passive-aggressive jokes, implying Jasmine was just a token diversity hire who spent her days handling low-level traffic tickets and petty civil disputes. They viewed her as an African-American woman who got incredibly lucky marrying into their supposedly prestigious upper-class family. They never bothered to actually read her resume or ask about her daily corporate responsibilities. They were entirely blinded by their own deeply ingrained arrogance and entitlement. They were catastrophically wrong about who she really was. Jasmine did not work at a low-tier law firm in the suburbs. Jasmine was the absolute legal powerhouse who single-handedly orchestrated the hostile corporate takeover of Horizon Trust 6 months ago. She graduated at the absolute top of her class from Harvard Law and spent 5 years tearing apart corrupt hedge funds for the Securities and Exchange Commission. She was the acting general counsel for Apex Capital. She was my right-hand woman, my trusted business partner, and the most ruthless corporate attorney on the entire West Coast. While Sylvia was criticizing her natural hair at Thanksgiving dinners, Jasmine was actively drafting federal acquisition documents worth billions of dollars. When Jasmine answered the phone, Her voice was crisp and strictly professional. I did not waste time with basic pleasantries or emotional breakdowns. I told her Richard had just initiated a $4.2 million fraudulent wire transfer using my forged signature as the primary guarantor. The line was completely silent for a moment as she processed the information. Then Jasmine let out a low, dark laugh that sent a satisfying chill through the quiet room. She asked me which regional bank he was genuinely dumb enough to use for the laundering process. When I told her he routed the stolen commercial real estate funds directly through Horizon Trust, she actually sighed in sheer disbelief at his monumental stupidity. I told her the money was currently in digital transit to a Delaware shell company named Blue Haven Holdings. I instructed her to immediately initiate a Level 4 silent freeze protocol across all associated accounts. The silent freeze is a highly specialized financial maneuver we developed specifically for high-stakes corporate acquisitions and hostile asset seizures. It means the money will successfully land in the destination account, but the exact moment it arrives, the funds become completely radioactive. The front-end banking application will show the $4.2 million sitting safely in the Delaware account. Richard will log in tomorrow morning from his corporate office and see that massive balance staring back at him. He will think he has officially won the game. He will celebrate with Lexi, believing his offshore escape plan worked perfectly. But the reality is entirely different. The money is legally locked in a phantom state. If he tries to move a single dollar out of that account to his designated offshore haven in the Cayman Islands, the banking system will instantly generate a hard internal decline. The silent freeze also automatically triggers a sealed notification directly to the Federal Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. It continuously builds an airtight evidentiary file in the background, logging every single internet protocol address he uses to check the balance. It records his digital keystrokes, his location data, and his specific device identifiers, while the criminal continues to go about their day completely unaware that they are already a ghost walking in the financial world. Jasmine typed rapidly on her mechanical keyboard on the other end of the line. She confirmed the silent freeze protocol was fully active and permanently embedded into the Horizon Trust mainframe. She told me she was personally locking down the Delaware holding company from the legal backend to ensure no secondary shell companies could be attached to the primary asset line. She asked me what my exact timeline was for the physical confrontation. I looked at the digital calendar application glowing on my right monitor. Richard had planned a lavish dinner party for Friday night at our Mercer Island home to ostensibly celebrate his corporate quarterly earnings. He explicitly invited his arrogant mother, his sycophantic tech colleagues, and brazenly he invited Lexi. It was the exact night he planned to hand me the final divorce papers and officially discard me from his life. He wanted an audience to witness my humiliation. I told Jasmine the execution would happen on Friday night directly in front of his entire hand-picked audience. I wanted every single person who ever looked down on us to witness his absolute destruction in real time. Jasmine promised she would have the federal asset forfeiture documents completely finalized and legally stamped by Thursday afternoon. She told me to let him enjoy his final 3 days of imaginary wealth and unchecked arrogance. We spent another 20 minutes meticulously reviewing the exact sequence of events for the dinner party, ensuring there were absolutely no legal loopholes he could exploit. We synchronized our digital access protocols so that when I gave the signal, she could immediately sever his corporate access from the Vanguard real estate servers. I hung up the phone and looked back at the glowing screens in my dark office. The massive wire transfer was now permanently marked as successfully completed. The money was officially gone from Vanguard and safely trapped inside my impenetrable digital vault. Richard had built his entire identity on the grand illusion of control and intellectual superiority. He truly thought he could casually destroy my life, bankrupt my supposed small business, and walk away incredibly wealthy to fund his new fantasy life with a younger woman. He had absolutely no idea that every single step he took toward his new life was carefully orchestrated by the two women his family had relentlessly underestimated and degraded for years. The financial trap was fully locked in place. The legal guillotine was raised high above his neck. All I had to do now was maintain my perfect stoic facade, wait patiently for Friday night to arrive, and watch him eagerly pull the lever himself. Friday evening arrived with the kind of crisp, clear Seattle weather that made our $3 million Mercer Island home look like a spread in an architectural magazine. I stood near the massive quartz kitchen island, watching the catering staff arrange the imported caviar and Wagyu beef appetizers. Richard had spared absolutely no expense for his supposed quarterly earnings celebration. He had hired a private chef from one of the most exclusive restaurants downtown and ordered 4 cases of vintage wine to impress his colleagues. The house was designed with floor-to-ceiling glass walls overlooking Lake Washington, reflecting the amber lights of the city skyline in the distance. It was a perfectly curated display of extreme wealth and unshakable success. But as I watched Richard greet his guests at the custom mahogany front door, I felt absolutely nothing but cold, clinical anticipation. He was wearing a custom-tailored Italian suit that cost more than most people made in a month. He was laughing loudly and clapping his hands on the shoulders of his arriving guests, projecting the image of a man who had completely conquered the world. He truly believed this house, this lifestyle, and this very night belonged entirely to him. He did not know that less than 48 hours ago, I had quietly transferred the deed of the Mercer Island property into a blind trust controlled entirely by my private equity firm. He was playing the role of the generous king while standing in a castle he no longer owned. The guest list was a predictable collection of corporate sycophants and arrogant tech executives from Vanguard Real Estate. These were the men who enabled his behavior and applauded his ruthlessness. They walked into my home with a profound sense of entitlement, handing their expensive coats to the hired staff without even making eye contact. I watched them congregate around the custom marble wet bar, pouring themselves generous glasses of single malt scotch and loudly discussing their latest commercial acquisitions. They spoke in aggressive financial jargon, tossing around terms like leveraged buyouts and hostile market capitalization as if they were masters of the universe. I moved quietly through the living room, offering polite smiles and brief nods, perfectly playing the role of the silent, supportive wife they all expected me to be. They largely ignored me, treating me like a piece of high-end furniture that came with the house. One of the senior vice presidents, a man named Greg, actually handed me his empty glass and asked me to fetch him another drink with extra ice. I took the glass from his hand with a pleasant smile and handed it directly to a passing waiter. I did not correct Greg or remind him that I was the hostess, not the help. Their collective arrogance was the exact blind spot I was relying on. They were so busy congratulating each other on their imaginary brilliance that they could not see the massive financial sinkhole opening up directly beneath their expensive leather shoes. The heavy front doors opened again, and the tension in the room subtly shifted. I turned toward the foyer and watched Lexi walk into my home. The sheer brazen audacity of Richard inviting his 26-year-old marketing director mistress to his marital home for a private dinner party was almost impressive in its absolute cruelty. He was not just trying to replace me, he was actively trying to humiliate me in front of his entire professional circle. Lexi was wearing a tight emerald green silk dress that was entirely inappropriate for a corporate dinner party, but perfectly designed to capture the immediate attention of Richard. She carried a designer handbag that I knew for a fact cost exactly $8,000 because I had personally tracked the purchase on his hidden credit card statement 2 weeks ago. Richard immediately broke away from his group of executives and walked over to greet her. He did not kiss her in front of the crowd, but the way he placed his hand on the small of her back and leaned in to whisper something in her ear told everyone in the room exactly what they were to each other. Several of the other executives exchanged knowing smirks. They all knew about the affair. They were all entirely complicit in the betrayal. Lexi looked across the room and her eyes locked onto mine. She offered me a sweet, overly practiced smile that dripped with condescension. She walked straight toward me, complimenting the flower arrangements and casually mentioning how much she loved the house. She spoke to me as if she was already measuring the windows for new curtains. Before I could respond to Lexi, the grating sound of my mother-in-law demanding attention echoed from the formal dining room. Sylvia had arrived 30 minutes early to heavily criticize the catering staff and rearrange the seating chart to ensure she sat directly at the head of the table next to Richard. Sylvia was a woman who wore her perceived social status like a weapon. She possessed no actual wealth of her own, relying entirely on her son to fund her luxury country club memberships and her extensive cosmetic procedures. Yet she walked through my home with the absolute authority of an invading queen. The private chef signaled that dinner was ready to be served, and the guests began filtering into the formal dining room. The table was a massive slab of polished walnut set for 24 people with heavy silver cutlery and crystal glassware. I took my assigned seat near the middle of the table, intentionally placing myself directly across from Sylvia and 2 seats away from Lexi. Richard took his place at the head of the table, raising his glass to welcome everyone and thanking them for their relentless dedication to Vanguard real estate. He did not mention me once in his opening toast. The first course was served promptly, but Sylvia immediately pushed her plate of seared scallops away with a loud, dramatic sigh of utter disgust. Sylvia picked up her heavy silver fork and tapped it against her crystal water glass to ensure the entire table was listening. She loudly complained that the catering was completely substandard and that the seafood was clearly frozen. The conversation around the large table immediately stopped. Everyone looked at Sylvia, and then they looked at me, expecting me to apologize for the perceived failure. Sylvia did not stop there. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the expensive table linens, and locked her cold eyes on my face. She delivered her insult with maximum volume, ensuring even the hired waiters standing in the corners of the room could hear her clearly. She stated that if Victoria had a real career instead of playing with spreadsheets all day, maybe Richard would not be so incredibly stressed and forced to hire such incompetent event planners. She sighed heavily, acting like the ultimate victim of my supposed mediocrity. She told the entire table that a man in his high-level executive position desperately needed a wife with actual vision and corporate ambition, not a glorified freelance bookkeeper who spent her days doing basic addition. A few of the executives awkwardly cleared their throats while Lexi openly smiled, taking a slow sip of her wine. The silence in the dining room was thick and heavy. Richard did not defend me. He simply looked down at his plate and cut his steak, allowing his mother to completely assassinate my character in my own home. I did not flush with embarrassment. I did not drop my gaze to the table. I did not offer a frantic apology or attempt to defend my supposed small business. I maintained absolute total eye contact with Sylvia. I reached out with a steady hand and picked up the heavy crystal decanter resting near my plate. It was a perfectly aged 2015 Cabernet Sauvignon from a private vineyard in Napa Valley. I slowly poured a generous amount of the dark red wine into my glass, watching the rich liquid swirl against the crystal. The complete lack of emotional reaction from me seemed to genuinely unnerve the guests sitting nearby. They expected tears or a shouting match. They did not expect absolute chilling silence. I set the heavy decanter down on the table with a soft, deliberate clink that echoed perfectly in the quiet room. I picked up my wine glass by the thin stem and took a very slow, measured sip. The wine was exceptionally bold and complex, perfectly matching the dark satisfaction blooming in my chest. I lowered the glass and looked directly at Sylvia. I offered her a perfectly polite, razor-sharp smile. I nodded my head in slow, calculated agreement. I kept my voice incredibly calm, steady, and entirely devoid of any anger. I told her she was absolutely right. I looked around the table, making brief eye contact with Richard and then with Lexi before bringing my gaze back to my arrogant mother-in-law. I stated very clearly that you are right, Sylvia, spreadsheets can be very revealing. The words hung in the air of the formal dining room, carrying a heavy double meaning that only I truly understood. Sylvia blinked in confusion, clearly thrown off balance by my immediate agreement. She had wanted a fight, and I had handed her a completely cryptic surrender. Richard finally looked up from his plate, his brow furrowing slightly as he tried to process my calm demeanor. He knew I was usually highly protective of my consulting business, but tonight I was completely unfazed by the public insult. He quickly brushed it off, raising his glass again to forcefully change the subject back to the commercial real estate market and his upcoming corporate promotions. The conversation slowly resumed around the table, but the energy had fundamentally shifted. Lexi kept shooting nervous glances in my direction, clearly unsettled by the coldness in my eyes. I went back to eating my dinner with perfect posture and perfect manners. Every bite of food tasted like pure victory. Sylvia thought she had successfully put me in my place by reducing my entire career to simple spreadsheets. She had absolutely no idea that those exact same spreadsheets contained the meticulously documented proof of the massive federal crimes committed by her son. She did not know that the basic addition I supposedly did all day was currently calculating the exact mandatory minimum federal prison sentence her son was about to serve. She did not know that her luxurious lifestyle, her country club fees, and her expensive car were entirely funded by the same bank her son had just brazenly defrauded. I took another sip of the dark red wine and allowed the dinner party to continue exactly as Richard had planned. He wanted an audience for my destruction. I was simply ensuring the audience was comfortably seated and perfectly fed before the main event truly began. Let them eat their steaks and drink their expensive wine. Let them laugh at my expense and celebrate their imaginary superiority. The digital clock in my mind was steadily counting down the hours, and the trap was already fully engaged. After Sylvia finished her pathetic attempt at character assassination, the dining room slowly settled back into a low hum of corporate gossip. I waited exactly 7 minutes before quietly excusing myself from the massive walnut table. I walked down the short hallway into the chef's kitchen under the guise of checking on the dessert service. The catering staff was busy plating individual portions of a dark chocolate ganache, topped with edible gold leaf, but they respectfully stepped aside when I entered. I stood near the marble island and poured myself a tall glass of sparkling water. The kitchen was incredibly cool and quiet, offering a brief sanctuary from the suffocating arrogance radiating from the formal dining room. I admired the flawless reflection on the polished stone countertops. It was a space I had meticulously designed down to the very last drawer handle, but I knew the peace would not last long. Predators who think they have successfully cornered their prey rarely let them breathe. I heard the sharp, deliberate click of high heels against the hardwood floor before she even rounded the corner. Lexi walked into my kitchen carrying her half-empty crystal wine glass. She moved with a slow, deliberate sway, attempting to project absolute confidence and complete ownership of a space she had absolutely no right to occupy. She stopped just a few feet away from me, leaning casually against the expensive quartz countertops. She looked around the immaculate kitchen, running her manicured fingers over the polished surfaces as if she was already planning a total home renovation. She did not see the catering staff quietly slipping out the back door to give us privacy. She only saw an older wife she believed she had successfully defeated. She truly thought this kitchen, this house, and this entire luxurious life were simply waiting for her to claim them. Lexi took a slow, arrogant sip of her red wine and smiled at me. It was not a friendly or sympathetic smile. It was the deeply condescending smirk of a young woman who thought she had just won the ultimate financial prize. She told me the dinner was lovely, but she found the overall atmosphere a bit stifling and outdated. She said Richard was a man with massive corporate ambitions, and he desperately needed an environment that matched his incredible drive. She looked me directly in the eyes and said he is simply outgrowing this phase of his life, Victoria. He's moving on to much bigger things, and he needs someone who truly understands the modern corporate landscape. Someone who can actually keep up with his fast pace instead of just managing a few basic spreadsheets in a dusty home office. She was directly echoing Sylvia's cruel insults, proving they had all thoroughly discussed my supposed inadequacies behind my back. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water and watched her perform. She was 26 years old and deeply intoxicated by her close proximity to stolen power. She thought sleeping with a vice president made her an equal partner in his vast financial empire. She was completely oblivious to the fact that Richard viewed her as nothing more than a disposable digital shield. She was the registered owner of the virtual proxy server and the recovery email address for the Delaware shell company. She was carrying the full legal weight of a multi-million-dollar federal crime on her own shoulders, and she actually thought she was just bragging about a successful new boyfriend. She honestly believed she was the brilliant architect of a new corporate dynasty. Lexi quickly decided my total silence was a sign of absolute defeat. She wanted to push the knife in just a little bit deeper to secure her perceived victory. She reached into her expensive designer handbag to retrieve her smartphone, pretending she needed to check an urgent text message from the office. As she pulled the phone from the leather pouch, she intentionally fumbled her grip. A heavy metal credit card slipped from her slender fingers and clattered loudly onto the pristine marble floor directly between us. She let out a soft theatrical gasp and offered a completely fake, hollow apology. "Oh, how terribly clumsy of me," she whispered, but she made absolutely no immediate move to pick it up. She wanted me to look at it. She wanted me to see the tangible physical proof of her elevated status in my husband's life. I looked down at the floor. It was a customized, solid metal Platinum American Express card. The sophisticated recessed lighting in the kitchen perfectly caught the raised embossed numbers, and the customized business name elegantly etched into the bottom corner. It did not say Vanguard Real Estate. It said Blue Haven Holdings. It was the exact domestic shell company Richard had registered in Delaware just 3 weeks ago. This was the physical access card directly linked to the Horizon Trust account currently holding the stolen $4.2 million. Richard had actually given his young mistress a platinum credit card tied directly to the stolen commercial equity line. His staggering arrogance was so monumental that he could not even wait for the divorce papers to be signed before letting her casually spend the embezzled corporate funds. I did not bend down to retrieve the card for her. I stood perfectly still and burned the entire 16-digit account number into my photographic memory. Exactly 3 hours ago, I was sitting at my encrypted digital terminal in my home office, actively monitoring that exact financial pipeline. I had personally flagged that specific platinum credit account for a hard federal audit using my executive override credentials at Apex Capital. I had watched the digital banking ledger update in real time as she purchased her expensive designer handbag for exactly $8,240. I watched the system flag a transaction when she booked 2 first-class plane tickets to the Cayman Islands for next Tuesday, which cost another $14,000. She also charged a massive retainer fee for an exclusive luxury real estate agent based in Georgetown, Grand Cayman. She was literally planning their tropical escape using capital illegally drawn from my digitally forged signature. Every single transaction she made on that card was being meticulously logged by the Federal Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. We had activated a specific tracking algorithm known as a geographical expenditure trace. This meant every time she swiped that heavy piece of metal, the banking system automatically captured the exact global positioning coordinates of the point-of-sale terminal. She was systematically adding another full year to her mandatory minimum prison sentence with every single luxury purchase she made. She thought the platinum card was a beautiful symbol of unlimited wealth and ultimate freedom. I knew it was a digital tracking device permanently locked around her ankle. The silent freeze protocol Jasmine and I initiated meant the underlying funds were completely untouchable for large offshore wire transfers, but we had deliberately left a tiny fraction of the credit limit open for small retail purchases. We wanted her to use it aggressively. We wanted the physical security cameras at high-end luxury boutiques to capture her face in high definition while she casually spent stolen federal funds. She finally bent down and picked up the card, brushing imaginary dust off the polished platinum surface. She smiled at me again, holding the card between her fingers like a loaded weapon she was preparing to fire. She looked at me, expecting me to finally break down into tears. She desperately wanted me to ask about the unfamiliar company name on the card or aggressively demand to know exactly why she had unfettered access to my husband's private money. She wanted the absolute satisfaction of watching the tragic realization wash over my face in real time. She wanted a screaming match in the middle of my own kitchen. Instead, I offered her an incredibly warm, genuine smile. It was the very first time I had smiled all evening, and it clearly caught her entirely off guard. I looked at the heavy platinum card resting proudly in her hand, and then I looked directly into her eyes. My voice was perfectly calm, incredibly steady, and dripping with absolute sincerity. I told her you should really enjoy the limit on that card, Lexi, because I hear federal commissaries have a much lower spending cap. The smug, triumphant expression completely vanished from her face in an absolute instant. Her perfectly glossed lips parted in sheer confusion. She blinked rapidly, staring at me as if I had just started speaking a completely foreign language. She tried to intellectually process the words federal and commissaries, but her brain could not bridge the massive gap between her imaginary luxury lifestyle and the brutal, impending reality of a federal prison sentence. She opened her mouth to ask me what I meant, but her voice completely failed her. The cold, absolute certainty burning in my eyes absolutely terrified her. She quickly shoved the platinum card back into her designer handbag, her hands suddenly shaking uncontrollably. She took a quick, clumsy step back from me, her expensive high heel catching slightly on the hardwood floor. She did not say another word to me. She turned around and practically fled from the kitchen, disappearing back into the safety of the crowded dining room. I finished my glass of sparkling water and set it gently on the marble counter, perfectly satisfied that the trap was tightening. The private chef and his catering staff began silently clearing the heavy dinner plates from the massive walnut table. They moved with the practiced efficiency of invisible ghosts, replacing the savory dishes with delicate porcelain plates holding the dark chocolate ganache desserts. The atmosphere in the dining room had grown noticeably louder and significantly more arrogant as the executives consumed their third and fourth glasses of vintage wine. I sat quietly in my chair, observing the specific social dynamics of the room. Lexi had returned from the kitchen completely pale and visibly shaken. She sat rigidly in her chair, barely touching her expensive dessert, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. She kept her hands firmly locked in her lap, keeping her designer handbag pressed tightly against her legs, as if the heavy platinum credit card inside was physically burning her skin. Sylvia was holding court at her end of the table, loudly detailing a completely fabricated story about her extensive charitable work to a junior vice president who looked desperate to escape the conversation. Jasmine sat quietly at the far end of the table, entirely unbothered by the noise. She wore a perfectly tailored dark suit and sipped her sparkling water with the calm, measured gaze of a seasoned predator evaluating a herd of oblivious prey. She caught my eye for a fraction of a second and offered a microscopic nod. We both knew the exact schedule of the evening, and we both knew Richard was preparing to make his final fatal move. Richard suddenly pushed his heavy dining chair back against the hardwood floor. The loud scraping sound immediately drew the attention of the entire room. He stood up slowly, smoothing the front of his custom Italian suit jacket with an air of absolute manufactured authority. He reached out and picked up his crystal wine glass, using his silver dessert spoon to gently tap the rim. The sharp ringing sound cut through the ambient noise of the corporate gossip and the soft clinking of silverware. The table fell completely silent. All 24 guests turned their attention to the head of the table. The executives sat up straighter, expecting a rousing corporate speech about upcoming quarterly profits or a massive new commercial acquisition. Lexi forced a weak smile onto her face, trying desperately to look like the proud, supportive partner she believed she was. Sylvia beamed with absolute maternal pride, clasping her hands together beneath her chin. Richard looked around the room, soaking in the undivided attention. He loved having an audience. He truly believed he was the absolute smartest man in any room he entered. He took a slow, dramatic sip of his red wine before setting the glass back down on the pristine table linen. He cleared his throat and began to speak with a voice engineered to project pure corporate dominance. He started by thanking everyone for coming to his home to celebrate what he called a milestone moment in his professional trajectory. He talked about the aggressive nature of the commercial real estate market and the relentless drive required to secure a position at the absolute top of the industry. He used words like momentum and strategic alignment, pacing slowly behind his chair like a motivational speaker addressing a crowd of loyal followers. He stated that true success requires constant evolution and the absolute willingness to shed any unnecessary dead weight that prevents upward mobility. The executives nodded in solemn agreement, completely unaware that they were being used as props in a domestic ambush. Richard then stopped pacing. He placed both hands firmly on the back of his chair and looked directly down the length of the table at me. The generic corporate rhetoric instantly vanished from his tone, replaced by a cold, calculated cruelty. He told the completely silent room that a man cannot build an empire if the people closest to him fundamentally lack vision. He stated that vision is the single most important currency in the modern world, and it is a tragedy when you realize you have spent 10 years tied to a partner who possesses absolutely none of it. The air in the dining room instantly evaporated. The junior executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly realizing this was not a standard corporate toast. "Greg, The senior vice president, who had earlier treated me like a waitress, slowly lowered his glass to the table. Even Sylvia looked momentarily surprised by the extreme public nature of the execution, though her surprise quickly morphed into a smug, satisfied grin. Richard did not break eye contact with me. He elevated his voice, ensuring every single word echoed clearly off the expensive glass walls of the dining room. He told the crowd that Victoria is a perfectly fine bookkeeper. He said she's great at basic addition and organizing petty cash receipts for local bakeries, but he declared that his life was moving into a stratosphere of wealth and complexity that required a true equal. He said he needed a partner who understood the aggressive nuances of high-level corporate finance and international market expansion. He casually gestured toward Lexi, who tried to sit up straighter despite the visible tremor in her hands. He told the room that he refused to let his monumental potential be anchored down by a woman whose greatest ambition was balancing a basic spreadsheet. I did not flinch. I did not gasp or drop my gaze. I sat perfectly still with my hands resting gently on the table, entirely unaffected by his theatrical attempt to break my spirit. My lack of emotional response seemed to briefly agitate him. He wanted tears. He wanted me to beg for his respect in front of his colleagues. When I gave him absolute silence, he decided to escalate the humiliation to the final level. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. He held it up for a brief moment, allowing the entire table to see the formal legal seal stamped on the front flap. He then tossed it casually down the length of the long walnut table. The heavy package slid across the polished wood, stopping exactly 2 feet away from my porcelain dessert plate. The physical sound of the heavy envelope hitting the table felt like a gunshot in the perfectly quiet room. Richard let out a short, condescending laugh. He told me those are the finalized divorce papers. Just a paper, Victoria? He said his lawyers had worked tirelessly all week to draft an extremely generous separation agreement because he did not want to see me completely destitute. He told me he was offering me a $150,000 cash settlement completely tax-free. He said it was more than enough money for me to rent a decent little apartment in the suburbs and buy a reliable used car. He smiled a predatory smile and told me I could also keep absolute sole ownership of my little consulting limited liability company. He emphasized the word little dripping with absolute disdain. He said he had no interest in my freelance bookkeeping business and that I could continue doing taxes for local flower shops without any interference from him. He framed the offer as an act of profound charity. He wanted his colleagues to view him as a magnanimous titan of industry who was generously taking care of the simple woman he was leaving behind. Then he outlined what he was keeping. He spoke with the absolute certainty of a man who believed he had completely rigged the game. He told the silent table that in exchange for the generous cash settlement and the retention of my worthless business, he would retain full ownership of the Mercer Island house. He waved his hand around the massive dining room, highlighting the $3 million property as his rightful kingdom. He stated he would also maintain full and exclusive ownership of his Vanguard real estate stock options and all of our supposedly joint investment portfolios. He claimed those assets were built entirely by his sweat, his networking, and his singular corporate vision. He told me I had absolutely no legal or moral right to the wealth he had accumulated. He looked at me with a gaze colder than ice and delivered his final public ultimatum. He told me to sign the papers right now. He said if I signed the documents immediately in front of these witnesses, he would wire the $150,000 into my personal checking account by Monday morning. He told me to save my remaining dignity sign, the legal documents, and pack my bags tonight. He stated very clearly that I had until midnight to completely vacate his property. The absolute silence that followed his ultimatum was deafening. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. 24 pairs of eyes were completely locked on my face, waiting for the inevitable breakdown. They expected me to scream or throw my water glass at his head. They expected me to run crying out the front door into the cold Seattle rain. What Richard had just done was undeniably brutal. He had turned the dissolution of our 10-year marriage into a corporate spectator sport. He had weaponized his wealth, his status, and his social circle to crush me into immediate submission. He thought the sheer, overwhelming pressure of the public audience would force me to blindly sign the documents just to escape the profound humiliation. He thought he was a brilliant psychological tactician. He was a complete and utter fool. As I looked down at the thick manila envelope resting on the polished walnut table, my mind was operating at the speed of a supercomputer. Richard thought he was successfully intimidating me into walking away from millions of dollars. He had absolutely no idea what he had actually just placed in front of me. By demanding I sign a legally binding separation agreement that completely severed our financial assets, he was handing me the ultimate legal shield. He was actively committing massive federal wire fraud through Horizon Trust. He had forged my signature to steal $4.2 million. If we remained legally married when the federal agents finally audited his accounts, my personal assets and my company could theoretically be tied up in years of agonizing federal litigation. The government would freeze everything we jointly owned while they investigated his crimes. But by forcing me to sign a document that explicitly granted me sole independent ownership of Apex Capital, he was legally insulating my $9 billion private equity firm from his impending federal indictment. He thought he was generously letting me keep a worthless freelance bookkeeping business. He did not know he was formally signing away any legal right to claim the very company that secretly owned the bank he was currently defrauding. He was legally amputating himself from the only financial lifeboat that could possibly save him. Furthermore, he was aggressively demanding the Mercer Island house and the investment portfolios. He did not realize that I had already completely liquidated the joint portfolios 3 days ago through a legal loophole in our original prenuptial agreement. He also did not know that the deed to the $3 million house was no longer in his name. He was aggressively demanding empty bank accounts and a house he was technically trespassing in. His monumental arrogance had completely blinded him to the basic mechanics of legal asset protection. He was so incredibly eager to humiliate me and impress his 26-year-old mistress that he had literally drafted the exact legal documents I needed to finalize his absolute destruction. I did not need to hire an attorney to draft a separation agreement to protect my wealth. Richard had paid his own expensive corporate lawyers to build the perfect, impenetrable fortress around my money. He had built the guillotine, placed his own head squarely in the wooden block, and was now aggressively demanding that I pull the release lever. I looked away from the manila envelope and slowly raised my eyes to meet his gaze. I did not look like a broken woman. I did not look like a humiliated wife begging for scraps from her wealthy husband. I looked directly at him with the cold, calculating eyes of a former federal forensic auditor who had just found the final piece of evidence needed to secure a maximum prison sentence. The silence in the room stretched on for several more seconds. Jasmine sat perfectly still at the end of the table, her face an absolute mask of professional stoicism, but I could see the faint trace of a predatory smile hiding in the corners of her eyes. She knew exactly what was inside that envelope, and she knew exactly what I was about to do. Richard crossed his arms over his chest, waiting for my surrender. He nodded toward the envelope, entirely confident in his ultimate victory. I took a slow, deep breath and prepared to give him exactly what he asked for. The heavy manila envelope sat in the exact center of my porcelain dessert plate, resting like a bomb waiting to detonate. The entire formal dining room plunged into an absolute suffocating silence. It was the kind of quiet where you could hear the subtle hum of the central climate control system and the faint patter of the Seattle rain against the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. 24 people held their collective breath. I could feel the intense weight of their stares pressing against my skin. Richard stood at the head of the polished walnut table, radiating a sickening aura of manufactured triumph. He had his chin tilted slightly upward, his shoulders squared, and his hands resting confidently on his hips. He looked like a man who believed he had just conquered a small nation instead of merely ambushing his wife of 10 years. The junior executives, sitting along the sides of the table, exchanged nervous but highly entertained glances. They were actively sneering. They shifted in their expensive leather chairs, eagerly anticipating a spectacular domestic breakdown. Greg, the senior vice president, actually leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table so he would not miss a single second of my impending humiliation. Sylvia was practically vibrating with malicious joy. She had one hand pressed dramatically to her chest, as if she was deeply offended by the tension, but the corners of her heavily lined mouth were turned up in a vicious smile. Lexi sat frozen. She was staring wide-eyed at the envelope, entirely unsure if she should celebrate or flee the room. She knew exactly what Richard was doing, but seeing the actual legal documents physically placed in front of me made the reality of her complicity unavoidable. Richard expected a hurricane of emotion. He expected me to dramatically push the chair back and scream about the decade of my life I had wasted supporting his ambitious career. He wanted me to violently tear the manila envelope into pieces and throw them directly in his face. He desperately needed me to cry and beg because my emotional devastation was the final metric he required to measure his absolute superiority. He fundamentally misunderstood the woman he had married. I did not see a devastating divorce decree sitting on my porcelain plate. I saw an immaculate, airtight legal liability waiver directly presented to me by the primary suspect of a major federal financial crime. By handing me these documents, Richard was formally severing our marital estate exactly 12 hours before his $4.2 million fraudulent wire transfer officially cleared the federal banking system. He thought he was trapping me into accepting a pathetic $150,000 settlement. He did not realize he was formally indemnifying me from the catastrophic financial fallout of his impending felony arrest. If I fought him and refused to sign the documents, our assets would remain legally entangled. The federal government would freeze my accounts, investigate my supposed small business, and drag me into years of agonizing legal discovery. But by aggressively demanding an immediate separation of assets, he was building a massive firewall between his massive financial crimes and my $9 billion private equity firm. He was practically begging me to step off the sinking ship and into a reinforced steel lifeboat he had built with his own two hands. My 8 years investigating white-collar sociopaths for the Internal Revenue Service had taught me one critical lesson. You must never interrupt an arrogant man while he is actively signing his own federal death warrant. He wanted me to take the paltry cash settlement and leave him the imaginary wealth. He did not know the accounts were already frozen in a phantom state. I slowly lifted my gaze from the manila envelope and let my eyes trace the length of the massive walnut dining table. I bypassed the sneering tech executives. I ignored the arrogant smirk permanently plastered across Sylvia's face. I did not even look at the terrified young marketing director sitting rigidly in her emerald green dress. My eyes locked directly onto Jasmine. My sister-in-law sat at the absolute farthest end of the table, projecting an aura of total unbothered calm. She was the only person in the room who truly understood the massive catastrophic scale of the financial trap Richard had just blindly walked into. She was the general counsel for Apex Capital. She was the legal architect who had spent the last 3 days meticulously preparing the federal asset forfeiture documents that would permanently destroy his entire corporate existence. While Sylvia and Richard viewed her as a token diversity hire at a low-tier law firm, she was actively holding the legal remote control to their total financial annihilation. Jasmine looked at me with a perfectly neutral expression. She did not smile. She did not adjust her posture. She simply blinked slowly and gave me a single, almost imperceptible micro-nod. It was a silent professional confirmation between the chief executive officer of a shadow equity firm and her top corporate attorney. The legal parameters were set. The federal trap was primed. I had absolute clearance to execute the final maneuver. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket. The movement was incredibly slow and perfectly deliberate. Several of the executives actually tensed in their chairs, perhaps briefly entertaining the ridiculous thought that I was reaching for a weapon. I pulled out my heavy black Montblanc fountain pen. The polished resin caught the ambient light of the crystal chandelier hanging above us. I smoothly unscrewed the cap and placed it gently on the table beside my water glass. I reached out and pulled the thick manila envelope toward me. The sound of the heavy paper sliding across the polished wood echoed loudly in the silent room. I calmly unclasped the metal fastener and pulled out the thick stack of legal documents. They were meticulously drafted by his expensive corporate lawyers, filled with aggressive clauses designed to strip me of any claim to the Mercer Island house, the investment portfolios, and his Vanguard real estate stock options. I did not bother reading the dense legal jargon. I did not need to. I already knew exactly what they contained because Jasmine had legally intercepted and reviewed a digital draft of these exact files 2 days ago. I turned directly to the final signature page. I smoothed the thick paper flat against the table. I held my Mont Blanc pen with a perfectly steady hand. I did not offer a single word of argument. I did not raise my voice or attempt to negotiate for a larger settlement. I simply pressed the gold nib of the pen against the paper and signed my name. My signature was flawless. It was a beautiful, sweeping script, completely devoid of any hesitation or emotional tremor. I signed the primary separation agreement. I signed the property relinquishment form. I signed the binding arbitration waiver. I executed every single document he demanded without a single second of delay. The sheer speed and absolute silence of my compliance completely derailed the energy in the room. The sneering executives stopped smiling. Their expressions shifted from cruel amusement to profound confusion. They were geared up to watch a brutal domestic battle, but I had just handed them a complete unconditional surrender without shedding a single tear. Sylvia leaned forward, her brow heavily furrowed, actively searching my face for any sign of hidden hysteria. Richard lowered his hands from his hips. The arrogant, triumphant posture he had struck just moments ago began to visibly deflate. He looked at the signed papers resting on the table as if they were suddenly covered in poison. This was not the reaction he had meticulously planned for. He wanted a fight. He wanted to publicly conquer me in front of his peers. My absolute stoic indifference was a complete psychological short circuit to his massive, narcissistic ego. I carefully screwed the cap back onto my Mont Blanc pen and placed it back inside my jacket pocket. I stacked the freshly signed legal documents into a perfectly neat pile and pushed them back across the table toward the center. I looked up and met Richard's deeply confused gaze. I kept my voice incredibly soft, but completely firm, ensuring the acoustic resonance of the room carried every single syllable to the very back of the dining hall. I told him, if this is what you want, Richard, the assets are separated as of this exact second. I did not say I was sorry. I did not wish him well. I established the exact legal timestamp of our financial separation. I wanted every single person in that room to serve as a designated witness to the precise moment he officially claimed total independent ownership of his impending federal felony. He had asked for complete control of his financial destiny, and I had just legally granted it to him in permanent black ink. Richard stared at the flawless black ink resting on the final signature line of the property relinquishment form. He blinked twice, as if he could not quite believe how incredibly easy it had been to break me. Then a slow, arrogant laugh rumbled in his chest and spilled out into the perfectly quiet dining room. It was not a laugh of genuine relief, but a harsh mocking sound designed to belittle my immediate compliance. He reached across the polished walnut table and snatched the thick stack of legal documents with greedy hands. He quickly flipped through the pages visually, verifying that I had not missed a single initial or required signature block. Once he was absolutely satisfied that the paperwork was completely legally binding, he carefully placed the folded manila envelope into the inner breast pocket of his custom-tailored suit jacket, patting it twice as if he was securing a highly valuable treasure. He looked down at me with an expression of supreme pity. He told the silent room that he was genuinely glad I had finally decided to act like a rational adult instead of a hysterical housewife. He told me that my absolute lack of ambition was a cancer he was finally cutting out of his life. He adjusted the cuffs of his expensive Italian suit and looked at his heavy gold watch. He stated that it was currently 8:30 in the evening. He reminded me in a voice dripping with absolute authority that the separation agreement I just signed granted him immediate and exclusive legal possession of the Mercer Island property. He told me I had exactly 3.5 hours to gather my personal clothing and vacate the premises entirely. He explicitly warned me not to touch any of the expensive artwork, the custom furniture, or the vintage wine collection because those assets now legally belonged entirely to his estate. He said if I was still inside the house when the clock struck midnight, he would not hesitate to call the local police and have me formally removed for criminal trespassing. The heavy tension that had suffocated the formal dining room just moments ago instantly vanished, replaced by a collective sigh of malicious relief. Lexi physically relaxed in her expensive leather chair. The terrifying memory of our brief kitchen encounter seemed to completely evaporate from her mind the exact second she saw Richard successfully secure the signed divorce papers. The condescending smirk slowly returned to her perfectly glossed lips. She reached out and placed her hand over Richard's, completely ignoring the fact that I was still sitting just a few feet away. She softly praised his brilliant negotiation skills and told him how incredibly proud she was of his corporate ruthlessness. Sylvia clapped her hands together in genuine delight, practically vibrating with maternal triumph. She loudly requested that the private chef bring out a bottle of their most expensive vintage champagne to properly celebrate the complete removal of the dead weight holding her brilliant son back from his true potential. The tech executives from Vanguard Real Estate quickly followed her lead. Greg, the senior vice president, raised his half-empty wine glass and offered a boisterous toast to Richard's newly acquired freedom and his impending executive promotion. They all laughed and cheered, clinking their expensive crystal glasses together in a sickening display of corporate tribalism. The executives were entirely blinded by their own privilege, convinced that my silence was the ultimate proof of his unquestionable dominance. They completely dismissed my physical presence, treating me as if I had already packed my bags and disappeared into the cold, dark Seattle rain. I was officially a ghost to them, a defeated woman who had foolishly surrendered her entire marital empire without firing a single defensive shot. They thought the battle was completely over and the victory was theirs. They had absolutely no idea the war had not even officially started. I remained seated in my expensive dining chair, perfectly still and entirely unbothered by their loud, obnoxious celebrations. I did not rush upstairs to pack my suitcases. I did not frantically call a private car service to take me away from the $3 million property. I simply watched them toast to their imaginary victory with the cold clinical detachment of a scientist observing a deeply flawed biological experiment. I slowly reached my right hand into the hidden side pocket of my tailored blazer, my fingers wrapped around the smooth, cold glass of my encrypted smartphone. I did not pull the device out and place it on the table. I kept it completely concealed beneath the heavy walnut wood, relying entirely on muscle memory to bypass the biometric security lock. I did not need to look at the bright screen to navigate the complex digital interface. I had memorized the exact spatial location of the digital keys. I opened my secure messaging application and navigated to the highly encrypted thread shared exclusively with my sister-in-law. Jasmine was still sitting quietly at the far end of the long dining table, sipping her sparkling water and watching the executives congratulate each other. She did not look in my direction, but I knew she was completely ready for my signal. I typed a single word using the silent digital keyboard: execute. I pressed the send button and felt the microscopic vibration confirm the message had successfully left my device and reached its intended target. I slowly removed my hand from my pocket and rested it gently on the table next to my porcelain dessert plate. My pulse remained steady, my breathing perfectly controlled. I was a conductor preparing to direct a symphony of absolute destruction. I took a slow, measured breath and visually locked onto the digital clock, glowing faintly on the digital thermostat mounted on the far wall. The absolute final countdown had officially begun. Exactly 60 seconds. That was the precise amount of time it took for our encrypted network to fully deploy the digital guillotine across multiple federal and private financial systems. While Richard was busy thanking his arrogant mother for her unwavering support and kissing Lexi on the cheek, a massive invisible storm was actively tearing through his entire corporate existence. During the first 15 seconds, Jasmine accessed the Apex Capital mainframe and manually terminated the phantom hold on the Delaware Shell Company. This aggressive digital action immediately forced the Horizon Trust banking servers to reconcile the massive $4.2 million wire transfer Richard had initiated 12 hours ago. By second 30, the archaic security algorithms at the regional bank detected the massive discrepancy between the forged guarantor signature and the newly activated federal asset forfeiture documents Jasmine had legally filed with the authorities. The system automatically triggered a catastrophic internal security breach protocol. The silent freeze protocol we had meticulously designed was no longer just a defensive mechanism. It was an active offensive weapon hunting its designated target. By second 45, the Horizon Trust mainframe initiated a complete and total lockdown of every single financial account associated with Richard's social security number and his corporate executive identification codes. His checking accounts, his savings accounts, his Vanguard real estate corporate expense accounts, and the customized platinum credit card resting inside Lex's designer handbag were instantly frozen and permanently flagged for active federal investigation. The system also automatically dispatched an encrypted digital dossier directly to the United States Department of Justice, detailing every single fraudulent keystroke Richard had made from his Vanguard corporate office. The digital dominoes were falling with absolute mathematical precision, silently crushing his entire financial empire while he stood in my dining room bragging about his unparalleled corporate vision. He had exactly 15 seconds of blissful, ignorant wealth left in his entire life. As the invisible 60-second timer reached its absolute conclusion, the severe physical manifestations of his digital destruction began to brutally breach the quiet atmosphere of the formal dining room. Richard was right in the middle of telling an arrogant joke about a failed commercial acquisition when the heavy gold Apple Watch, strapped to his left wrist, violently vibrated. The sudden aggressive buzzing sound was surprisingly loud in the echoing room. He paused his story and glanced down at the glowing square screen, fully expecting a congratulatory text message from another wealthy corporate colleague. Instead, his brow furrowed in deep, genuine confusion. He tapped the small glass screen with his index finger, trying to immediately clear the notification, but the device vibrated again, this time producing a sharp, urgent chiming noise, indicating a critical financial security alert. Before he could verbally process the severe warning on his wrist, his smartphone resting face up on the polished walnut table directly in front of him suddenly illuminated the room. The large screen flashed bright red, and the phone began to loudly ring with a harsh blaring tone he had specifically assigned to his primary corporate banking application. Richard stared at his ringing phone, his arrogant confidence slowly draining from his face as his brain struggled to comprehend why a mid-tier regional bank in Oregon was frantically trying to contact him at 8:30 on a Friday night. The loud, obnoxious ringing instantly killed the celebratory mood in the entire room. Sylvia stopped speaking mid-sentence, and the tech executives slowly lowered their champagne glasses, staring blankly at the vibrating device. Richard let out a deeply irritated sigh and reached for his phone, muttering a quick, annoyed apology about an aggressive automated fraud alert. But just as his fingers brushed the smooth glass screen, a second device joined the chaotic digital symphony. Lexi jumped slightly in her chair, startled by the sudden aggressive noise coming from her own purse. Her smartphone, buried deep inside her expensive $8,000 designer handbag, began to frantically ring. It was not her standard cheerful musical ringtone. It was the harsh, generic, automated tone used exclusively by American Express for emergency critical account closures. The perfectly orchestrated corporate celebration was completely shattered, replaced entirely by the terrifying synchronized sound of absolute financial ruin. The synchronized ringing of the two phones completely paralyzed the celebratory atmosphere in the formal dining room. Richard looked down at his bright red screen and scoffed. He actually rolled his eyes at his assembled colleagues, as if this sudden interruption was merely a minor administrative annoyance directly related to his massive wealth. He wanted to use this exact moment to demonstrate his absolute corporate dominance. He wanted to show his junior executives exactly how a high-powered vice president handles a minor banking error. Instead of silencing the device or stepping into the hallway for privacy, he picked up the phone and pressed the green speaker button. He dropped the device right back onto the center of the polished walnut table, allowing the audio to broadcast loudly across the entire room. He leaned back in his expensive leather chair, crossing his arms over his chest with a deeply condescending smirk. He loudly greeted the caller, demanding to know why Horizon Trust was bothering him outside of standard business hours. The voice that echoed out of the small speaker was not the apologetic tone of a subservient customer service agent. It was the cold, clinical, and highly modulated voice of a senior fraud investigator from the Federal Compliance Division. The agent did not offer a polite greeting. He immediately asked Richard to verify his full legal name and his social security number for a recorded federal line. Richard laughed a harsh, arrogant sound and refused to provide his information, stating he was a premium commercial client and demanded to speak to a regional director. The agent on the speakerphone remained entirely unfazed by the aggressive posturing. The voice simply proceeded with the formal legal notification. The investigator clearly stated that this was a mandatory compliance notification from the Horizon Trust Financial Crimes Enforcement Division. The agent announced that exactly 3 minutes ago, the $4.2 million commercial wire transfer initiated from the Vanguard real estate corporate accounts had been permanently flagged for felony embezzlement and digital forgery. The words felony embezzlement echoed off the glass walls of the dining room. Sylvia suddenly stopped breathing. The tech executives sitting around the table completely froze, their champagne glasses hovering halfway to their mouths. Richard abruptly dropped his arrogant posture. He uncrossed his arms and leaned heavily over the table, staring down at the phone as if it had just grown fangs. He aggressively barked at the speakerphone, telling the agent there was a catastrophic system error and that the transfer was a fully authorized corporate equity line. The agent completely ignored his shouting. The cold voice continued reading from the prepared legal script. The agent stated that due to the severe nature of the forged guarantor signature attached to the commercial lending agreement, a total structural freeze had been placed on his entire financial portfolio. The voice meticulously listed the consequences in real time. The agent announced that his primary checking account was now locked with a zero available balance. His high-yield savings accounts were entirely frozen pending federal review. His Vanguard corporate expense accounts were completely suspended. And finally, all associated lines of credit, including the secondary platinum card issued under the Delaware holding company, Blue Haven Holdings, were permanently revoked and reported to the federal authorities. While the horrific reality of the speakerphone broadcast was actively destroying Richard, Lexi was experiencing her own private digital nightmare just 3 seats away. The moment my Mont Blanc pen had touched the separation agreement, her anxiety had peaked. She had covertly pulled her smartphone from her designer handbag under the table, desperately trying to order an expensive private car service to quietly escape the suffocating tension of the dining room. She had entered her destination and selected the premium black car option, entirely reliant on the customized metal credit card Richard had given her. She pressed the confirm button on her screen exactly when the Horizon Trust agent mentioned the revoked lines of credit. Lexi stared down at her glowing screen in absolute terror. The ride-sharing application displayed a bright red error message stating her primary payment method had been aggressively declined by the issuing bank. She frantically tapped the screen, attempting to process the payment a second time. The system immediately rejected the heavy platinum card, again this time generating a severe secondary warning that the card had been flagged for fraudulent activity. Lexi began to physically hyperventilate. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking like a terrified child dressed in expensive emerald silk. She looked up from her phone, her wide eyes darting wildly around the silent dining room. She realized with absolute horrifying clarity that the magical plastic shield she thought protected her was completely gone. She was stranded in the suburbs with no money, no escape route, and a direct connection to a massive federal crime. Richard was completely losing his mind. His face turned a deep mottled shade of crimson. The perfectly tailored suit suddenly looked like a straitjacket. He slammed both of his hands flat against the walnut table, causing the crystal dessert plates to violently rattle. He screamed directly into the speakerphone, projecting pure, unhinged rage. He demanded that the agent immediately lift the security hold. He yelled that this was a massive violation of his corporate rights and that he would personally sue the entire bank for gross negligence. He puffed out his chest, trying to reclaim the rapidly evaporating illusion of his power. He shouted that he was the vice president of Vanguard Real Estate and that he managed hundreds of millions of dollars in commercial assets. He threatened to completely liquidate every single Vanguard account held at Horizon Trust by Monday morning if his access was not instantly restored. He demanded to know exactly who gave a low-level bank employee the authority to freeze the assets of a senior corporate executive. The dining room was so quiet you could hear the rain hitting the glass outside. The executives were staring at Richard in absolute horror. They were witnessing the total, catastrophic collapse of their arrogant leader. They knew exactly what felony embezzlement meant for the corporate reputation of Vanguard. Greg, the senior vice president, slowly pushed his chair back, away from the table, actively trying to put physical distance between himself and the radioactive crime scene. Sylvia was clutching her chest, her mouth opening and closing, but no sound coming out. She looked at her son with a mixture of profound confusion and mounting terror. The brilliant golden child she had worshipped and protected her entire life was completely unraveling in front of her very eyes. Her lavish lifestyle, funded entirely by his stolen corporate money, was instantly evaporating into the cold Seattle air. The Horizon Trust investigator waited patiently for Richard to stop screaming. The agent did not raise his voice. He did not offer an apology. He delivered the final fatal blow with the cold mechanical precision of a sniper pulling the trigger. The voice echoed clearly through the small speaker, filling the entire room with absolute undeniable truth. The agent stated that Horizon Trust did not act on its own authority. The agent calmly informed Richard that Vanguard Real Estate no longer held any active accounts with their institution because the parent company had officially authorized the total financial freeze. Richard stopped breathing. He stared at the phone, completely paralyzed. He managed to stammer out a single confused question, asking what parent company the agent was talking about. Vanguard was an independent commercial firm. They did not have a parent company. The agent responded immediately. The voice was crisp and completely devoid of human empathy. The investigator stated very clearly that Vanguard Real Estate had been quietly acquired through a blind equity buyout exactly 3 days ago. The agent said the freeze on the $4.2 million fraudulent wire transfer, the lockdown of the Delaware Shell Company, and the permanent revocation of all his executive access codes were directly authorized by the sole controlling entity of that parent company. The agent paused for a fraction of a second, ensuring the final sentence would land with maximum devastating impact. The voice from the phone calmly declared that Vanguard Real Estate is now entirely owned by Apex Capital, and the parent company has officially authorized this freeze. The automated system then abruptly terminated the call. A sharp dial tone echoed through the speaker before the phone screen went completely black. The silence that rushed back into the room was heavier than concrete. Richard slowly raised his head. His eyes were wide and completely vacant. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was finally realizing there was no ground beneath him. He looked at the junior executives who were now actively staring at him with undisguised disgust. They were already mentally drafting their resignation letters and calling their personal attorneys to shield themselves from the incoming federal investigation. He looked at Lexi, who was quietly sobbing into her hands, realizing her luxurious future had just evaporated into thin air. He looked at his mother, who was pale and trembling completely, unable to comprehend how her brilliant son had just been implicated in a federal crime during his own dinner party. Then he slowly turned his head and looked down the length of the long walnut table directly at Jasmine. My sister-in-law sat perfectly still. She reached out and took a slow, deliberate sip of her sparkling water. She gently set the crystal glass back down onto the pristine table linen. She looked at Richard with an expression of absolute unyielding authority. She did not smile, but her eyes were burning with the cold, intense fire of absolute victory. She had endured years of his racist condescension, his arrogant jokes, and his profound disrespect. She had sat quietly at countless family dinners while he mocked her career and dismissed her intelligence. Now she was the executioner, holding the freshly sharpened blade directly over his neck. She was the one who had legally orchestrated the silent freeze, and she was the one who had personally signed the corporate termination order. Richard swallowed hard, his throat completely dry. He looked back at me. I was still sitting in my chair with my hands resting gently on the table. The freshly signed divorce papers were sitting safely inside his suit pocket. He had forced me to sign away my legal connection to Vanguard Real Estate, entirely unaware that I already owned the parent company that just legally froze his entire existence. I had allowed him to dig his own grave jump into the dark hole and eagerly hand me the shovel. he finally understood the massive, catastrophic scale of his own stupidity. He realized the quiet freelance bookkeeper he had mocked and discarded was the apex predator of the financial world. The dominoes had completely fallen, and they had crushed his empire into absolute dust. The weekend had been an absolute financial bloodbath for Richard. By Monday morning, the horrific reality of his situation had fully materialized, completely destroying the arrogant facade he had maintained for a decade. He had spent Saturday and Sunday completely locked out of the Mercer Island house. The digital locks were changed exactly at midnight on Friday, and my private security team was standing on the front porch waiting for him. He had nowhere to go because Lexi had abruptly abandoned him. The moment she realized the customized platinum card was dead and the federal authorities were actively watching, she packed her expensive bags and fled. She did not even say goodbye. She simply emptied the luxury apartment, took the expensive diamond jewelry he had recently purchased for her, and left a brief text message telling him to never contact her again before permanently disconnecting her phone number. Richard was forced to sleep on a cheap sagging mattress in a budget motel near the airport using the last remaining physical cash he had in his leather wallet. The room smelled heavily of stale smoke and bleach, a stark contrast to the luxurious life he believed he had secured. He had spent the entire weekend desperately calling his wealthy tech colleagues, begging for short-term loans to cover his immediate legal expenses. Every single one of them had completely ignored his calls. Greg, the senior vice president, who had happily drank our vintage wine and celebrated his cruelty on Friday night, had instantly severed all ties with him. Greg even sent a formal legal cease and desist email to Richard's personal address, stating that any further contact would be considered corporate harassment. They all knew he was financially radioactive, and they had absolutely no intention of sinking with his ship. He arrived at the Vanguard Real Estate corporate headquarters at exactly 7 in the morning. The dark circles under his eyes and the severe wrinkles in his usually immaculate custom Italian suit told the entire story of his rapid descent into absolute ruin. He had not shaved in 2 days, and his hands carried a slight visible tremor. He did not look like a triumphant vice president preparing for a massive promotion and a new life in the Cayman Islands. He looked like a desperate, hunted animal backed completely into a corner. When Richard approached the primary security turnstiles in the Grand Marble lobby, he confidently slapped his corporate identification badge against the digital scanner, expecting the usual deference. Instead of the familiar green light and the soft chime of granting access, the scanner flashed a harsh red light and emitted a loud buzzing sound. Access denied. He tried it 3 more times, his panic visibly rising with every single rejection as other employees walked past him. He aggressively flagged down a security guard demanding to be let through the gates. The guard looked at his digital tablet and coldly informed Richard that his executive clearance had been permanently revoked by the Human Resources Department late Friday night. Richard began to shout, causing a massive, humiliating scene in the middle of the crowded corporate lobby. He claimed there was a catastrophic administrative error and demanded immediate access to the top-floor executive boardroom. He yelled that he had a critical emergency meeting with the new ownership group from Apex Capital. The security guard was completely unmoved by the aggressive display of corporate entitlement. He calmly picked up his radio and contacted the upper management floor while Richard paced furiously in front of the locked turnstiles. After a tense 2-minute wait, the guard finally received authorization to grant Richard a temporary visitor pass. He was handed a cheap paper badge and escorted to the executive elevator like a common vendor, not a senior vice president who used to command the entire building. Richard stepped off the elevator on the 50th floor and immediately felt a heavy shift in the corporate atmosphere. The usual bustling energy of the commercial real estate firm was entirely gone, replaced by an eerie, suffocating silence. As he walked down the main hallway, he glanced toward his former corner office. The large glass walls were completely covered with thick brown paper, and a federal asset seizure notice was prominently taped directly to the heavy glass door. He could see the shadowy silhouettes of federal agents in windbreakers moving around inside, actively boxing up his private files and confiscating his corporate computers. He quickly looked away, his stomach actively turning at the sight of his completely dismantled corporate kingdom. He was directed by the silent security guard into the primary executive boardroom at the end of the hall. It was a massive room dominated by a long mahogany table and 24 plush leather chairs overlooking the sprawling Seattle skyline. Richard walked to the far end of the long table, pacing back and forth across the expensive carpet. The rain was beating heavily against the floor-to-ceiling windows, matching the chaotic storm raging inside his head. His hands were shaking uncontrollably as he wiped a bead of cold sweat from his forehead. He kept checking his heavy gold Apple Watch, completely forgetting that it was no longer connected to his frozen bank accounts and could not receive any external messages. He was actively rehearsing the exact pitch he planned to deliver to the mysterious executives from Apex Capital. He truly believed he could talk his way out of a federal indictment if he just got in front of the right billionaire. He calculated the exact numbers in his head. He needed exactly $5 million to survive this catastrophic disaster. He needed the original $4.2 million to quietly replace the stolen commercial equity line before the federal investigators formally submitted the final indictment to the grand jury. He needed an additional $800,000 to retain a high-level, white-collar criminal defense attorney and cover the immediate legal penalties associated with his frozen accounts. He was actively planning to offer the shadow owners of Apex Capital his absolute unquestioning loyalty and a massive 50% cut of his future commercial real estate commissions for the next decade. He was entirely convinced that private equity firms only cared about raw profit and completely ignored all ethical and legal boundaries. He thought he could casually bond with them over the ruthless, aggressive nature of corporate finance. He planned to frame the forged guarantor signature and the Delaware Shell Company as a brilliant but slightly misunderstood aggressive tax strategy. He would blame the entire failure of the transaction on my supposed financial incompetence, claiming his bitter ex-wife had maliciously filed a false fraud report out of sheer jealousy over his new relationship. He was actively preparing to sell my reputation and my freedom to save his own skin, entirely unaware of who actually owned the company he was desperately trying to manipulate. He also planned to completely sacrifice Lexi without a single second of hesitation. He rehearsed a detailed speech where he would explicitly tell the Apex Capital executives that his young marketing director had gone completely rogue. He would claim she had secretly accessed his private computer, manipulated the digital files, copied my signature, and initiated the fraudulent wire transfer entirely without his knowledge. He was ready to hand her directly to the federal authorities on a silver platter just to ensure his own survival. His sheer capacity for betrayal was absolutely limitless. He paced faster, muttering the fabricated story under his breath, ensuring there were no logical gaps in his massive web of lies. Every single minute that passed in that empty boardroom felt like a physical weight pressing down on his chest. He stopped pacing and leaned heavily against the cold mahogany table, resting his face in his trembling hands. The sheer magnitude of his absolute failure was slowly starting to penetrate his massive, narcissistic ego. He had spent 10 years meticulously building a flawless public image as a brilliant, wealthy commercial real estate mogul. Now he was a pathetic beggar, waiting for a mysterious corporate bailout. He pulled out his encrypted smartphone to check his emails, but the device was completely locked. The internal security protocols at Vanguard had permanently wiped his device the moment he stepped into the building, completely erasing his entire digital address book, his private corporate messages, and his highly secure files. He was entirely disconnected from the outside world. He was a ghost trapped inside the very machine he used to control. He looked up at the massive double doors of the boardroom, actively praying for the Apex Capital executives to walk through. He wanted an old, wealthy white man in a bespoke suit to walk in and offer him a cigar and a way out of this absolute nightmare. He wanted to shake hands with a fellow predator and make a mutually beneficial deal. He smoothed down his wrinkled jacket and stood up straight, trying to project a false aura of absolute confidence. He wiped his sweaty palms against his expensive trousers, hoping they would not notice his intense fear. He adjusted his collar one last time. He told himself he was Richard, the untouchable vice president, and he was far too valuable to be completely discarded by a massive private equity firm. He repeated his rehearsed lies under his breath over and over again, trying to memorize the exact cadence and tone that would sound the most convincing. He practiced his apologetic yet confident smile in the reflection of the glass window. He was completely ready to play the role of the incredibly brilliant but temporarily misunderstood corporate genius. He just needed the mysterious shadow owners to walk through those doors and give him a single chance to speak his mind. He had absolutely no idea that the people waiting on the other side of those thick wooden doors were the exact same women he had spent his entire life actively degrading and deeply underestimating. The final trap was perfectly set, and the boardroom was entirely silent, waiting for the absolute slaughter to begin. The massive double doors of the executive boardroom finally clicked open. The heavy brass handles turned with a sharp metallic sound that echoed like a gunshot in the perfectly quiet room. Richard immediately stopped his frantic pacing and spun around to face the entrance. He aggressively straightened his posture and plastered a desperate, ingratiating smile on his face, completely ready to beg for his professional life. He expected a team of older white men in conservative grey suits to walk through those doors. He expected the traditional demographic of billionaire private equity owners that he was so accustomed to dealing with and manipulating. He was fully prepared to shake hands, offer premium cigars, and speak the aggressive language of high-level corporate finance. He had his entire fabricated story ready to deploy, blaming the forged signature on a rogue young employee and painting himself as the tragic victim of a bitter ex-wife. Instead, the heavy wooden doors swung wide open and Jasmine walked into the room. She did not look like the quiet, submissive sister-in-law who endured his racist microaggressions at family Thanksgiving dinners. She was no longer wearing the understated, conservative dresses he always mocked as cheap and unprofessional. Jasmine strode into the corporate boardroom wearing a flawlessly tailored $4,000 dark charcoal Tom Ford suit that screamed of absolute uncompromising authority. The sharp lines of the blazer and the perfect cut of the trousers projected an image of a woman who completely owned every single inch of the ground she walked on. She carried a massive leather binder tucked securely under her left arm, holding the absolute physical proof of his complete financial ruin. Her natural hair was styled in an immaculate crown of braids, and her expression was a mask of cold, unyielding stone. She did not offer him a polite greeting or a friendly family smile. She walked into the room with the measured, predatory grace of an executioner stepping up to the chopping block. She moved past the expensive leather chairs, completely ignoring his physical presence as she made her way directly toward the head of the long mahogany table. Her expensive heels clicked against the hardwood floor with a rhythmic, terrifying precision. Richard stared at her in absolute disbelief. The desperate, ingratiating smile completely melted off his face, instantly replaced by a deep, ugly sneer of pure, arrogant confusion. His massive, narcissistic ego completely refused to process the reality of the situation unfolding right in front of him. Even after suffering the catastrophic financial freeze and losing his entire corporate kingdom, he still fundamentally viewed Jasmine as a low-tier traffic lawyer who had merely gotten lucky marrying his younger brother. He genuinely thought she had somehow heard about his massive public humiliation at the dinner party and had driven to the Vanguard corporate headquarters to personally gloat or offer pathetic legal advice. He let out a harsh, mocking scoff that sounded incredibly loud in the empty room. He crossed his arms over his chest and glared at her, completely abandoning the polite corporate facade he had spent the last hour meticulously rehearsing. He aggressively demanded to know what she was doing on the restricted executive floor. He told her this was a highly secure commercial real estate firm, and she had absolutely no security clearance to be wandering around the building. He raised his voice, projecting the dying embers of his former authority, and shouted, "What the hell is my brother's wife doing here?" He aggressively waved his hand toward the door, treating her like a lost, completely incompetent child who had accidentally wandered into a restricted zone. He told her to get out of the boardroom immediately before he called the security desk to have her forcibly removed from the premises. He leaned forward, placing both hands on the mahogany table, and loudly demanded that she stop wasting his valuable time and go get him the actual general counsel of Apex Capital. He truly believed he was still in charge of the narrative and could simply order her away like a nuisance. He threatened to call her husband and complain about her deeply unprofessional behavior, entirely blind to the sheer absurdity of his own words. He told her he was dealing with multi-million-dollar federal issues and did not have time to play family games with someone who barely understood basic contract law. Jasmine did not flinch at his shouting. She did not look intimidated or offended by his aggressive corporate posturing. She simply reached the head of the massive mahogany table and placed the thick leather binder down on the polished wood. The heavy thud of the binder hitting the table sounded like a gavel dropping in a federal courtroom. She slowly unbuttoned the front of her expensive Tom Ford blazer and took a seat in the oversized leather chair traditionally reserved for the chief executive officer. She leaned back against the plush leather, resting her arms on the armrests with the absolute comfort of a monarch sitting on her rightful throne. She looked up at Richard, her eyes completely devoid of any familial warmth or human sympathy. She reached into the inner pocket of her tailored suit and pulled out a single rectangular piece of thick premium cardstock. She held it between her index and middle fingers for a fraction of a second, allowing the ambient light of the boardroom to catch the elegant gold foil embossing. Then, with a single crisp flick of her wrist, she tossed the card across the smooth wooden surface. It slid perfectly straight, stopping exactly 3 inches from Richard's white knuckles. Richard looked down at the small piece of paper. His eyes struggled to focus on the sharp black text printed across the center. He read the heavy block letters over and over again, as if his brain completely lacked the capacity to translate the English language. The card was printed on heavy matte stock with the unmistakable watermark of a multi-billion-dollar financial institution. It did not say diversity hire. It did not say suburban family lawyer. It read, Jasmine Davis, General Counsel, Apex Capital. The absolute horrific realization hit him with the physical force of a speeding freight train. The oxygen was completely sucked out of his lungs. He stumbled backward, taking a clumsy step away from the table as his knees visibly buckled beneath the weight of his own monumental stupidity. He looked from the business card up to her face, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. Jasmine watched him physically crumble with an expression of pure, unadulterated satisfaction. She rested her elbows on the armrests of the heavy leather chair and steepled her fingers together beneath her chin. When she finally spoke, her voice did not echo with anger or vindictive rage. It dripped with absolute freezing authority. She commanded him to sit down, Richard. Her words were not a polite suggestion. They were a direct legal order from the apex predator of his new reality. She watched his chest heave as he struggled to draw a full breath. She looked around the massive boardroom, gesturing gracefully toward the floor-to-ceiling glass windows and the expensive custom furniture. She locked her dark, unyielding eyes directly onto his pale, sweating face and delivered the final absolute truth. She told him, "You are currently sitting in my building." The silence that followed her statement was absolute. Richard fell back into the nearest chair, his body completely devoid of any remaining strength. He stared at the brilliant, powerful African-American woman he had spent 10 years actively mocking and realized she was the exact person who had legally authorized the complete destruction of his entire life. He had begged for a meeting with the shadow owners of Apex Capital, and she had graciously answered his call. Jasmine opened the thick leather binder resting in front of her, revealing hundreds of pages of perfectly documented digital evidence. She exposed the printed logs of his internet protocol addresses, the time-stamped screenshots of the forged guarantor signatures, and the exact geographical coordinates of every single purchase his mistress made on the stolen platinum credit card. She methodically flipped through the pages detailing the exact structure of his federal wire fraud case. She told him he had exactly one opportunity to listen to the terms of his total unconditional surrender, and if he interrupted her even once, she would personally ensure the federal agents waiting down the hall dragged him out of the building in handcuffs right this very second. She reminded him that every single arrogant joke he had ever made at her expense had only sharpened the blade she was currently holding to his corporate throat. She leaned forward, tapping her manicured fingernail against the physical copy of the fraudulent lending agreement he had signed just days ago. She explained in grueling, excruciating detail how his absolute lack of respect for the women in his life had been the singular, fatal flaw in his seemingly perfect criminal plan. He had viewed his wife as a useless bookkeeper and his sister-in-law as a token employee, entirely failing to recognize that they were actually the chief executive officer and the general counsel of the exact private equity firm that silently controlled his entire industry. Jasmine closed the heavy leather binder with a sharp, definitive snap that made Richard physically jump in his seat. She told him his career in commercial real estate was permanently over and his future now rested entirely in the hands of the federal justice system. The brilliant, arrogant vice president was officially nothing more than a broken criminal waiting for his mandatory minimum prison sentence to be formally handed down by a federal judge later this afternoon. Jasmine finished dismantling the last remaining shred of his corporate ego and closed the heavy leather binder with a sharp snap. She let the deafening silence hang in the cold boardroom for several long seconds, allowing the terrifying reality of the federal indictment to completely sink into his brain. Richard was hyperventilating, his chest heaving violently under his wrinkled custom suit. He stared at her with bloodshot eyes completely broken and waiting for the final execution order. Jasmine did not deliver the final blow herself. She simply tilted her head slightly and raised her right hand, gesturing gracefully toward the massive double doors of the executive boardroom. The heavy brass handles clicked open for the second time this morning. I walked into the room. I was not wearing the casual sweaters and sensible flat shoes he was so accustomed to seeing me wear in my home office. I was dressed in a pristine white tailored blazer with razor-sharp lapels paired with charcoal trousers and black leather stiletto heels that clicked against the hardwood floor with the precise rhythm of a ticking clock. My hair was pulled back into a severe, flawless knot, and my expression was entirely devoid of any warmth or familiar affection. I did not look like the humble freelance bookkeeper he had publicly discarded at his lavish dinner party. I looked exactly like the apex predator of the financial food chain that I truly was. I walked straight past the empty leather chairs, ignoring the massive glass windows overlooking the Seattle skyline. Jasmine immediately stood up from the oversized executive chair at the head of the mahogany table. She respectfully stepped to the side, yielding the absolute position of power directly to me. I took my seat in the chief executive officer's chair, resting my hands lightly on the polished wood. Richard stared at me as if a ghost had just materialized in the center of his corporate sanctuary. The remaining color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin the pale, sickly shade of cold ash. His jaw literally dropped open, his mouth working desperately to form a single coherent word. He gripped the edges of the mahogany table so tightly that his knuckles turned completely white. He looked from Jasmine to me and then back to Jasmine, his shattered mind desperately trying to process the impossible image of his discarded wife taking the absolute highest seat of power in his own commercial real estate firm. He finally managed to push a frantic, breathless whisper past his trembling lips. He asked Victoria, "What are you doing here?" His voice was completely stripped of its usual booming arrogance. It was the terrified, pathetic squeak of a cornered animal realizing the trap was entirely inescapable. I did not immediately answer his question. I mirrored Jasmine's earlier calm movements, reaching into my pristine white blazer to retrieve a slim black dossier. I placed it gently on the table, right next to the massive leather binder Jasmine had brought in. I placed my right hand flat over the dark cover of the folder and looked directly into his bloodshot eyes. I let him endure the suffocating silence for a few more seconds, watching the intense physical panic radiate through his shaking hands. When I finally spoke, my voice was incredibly soft, but it carried the chilling absolute weight of a federal judge reading a mandatory life sentence. I told him he had made a series of catastrophic miscalculations over the past 10 years, but his greatest mistake was assuming my silence was a symptom of my stupidity. I told him I had spent a decade watching him build a fragile glass empire, funded entirely by his own towering narcissism and unchecked greed. I said I had happily played the role of the quiet, supportive wife because it provided the absolute perfect camouflage for my actual corporate operations. I slowly slid the slim black dossier across the long mahogany table. The smooth friction of the premium paper against the polished wood was the only sound in the entire room. The folder came to a perfect stop exactly 1 inch away from his trembling fingers. I instructed him to open it. He hesitated, staring at the black cover as if it were a loaded explosive device. His hands shook violently as he finally reached out and flipped the cover open. Resting right on top of the stack of papers was a certified legal copy of the exact separation agreement he had aggressively thrown at me during the Friday night dinner party. My flawless signature was stamped on the bottom line, standing as a permanent legal monument to his monumental arrogance. I watched his eyes scan the familiar document, still completely failing to understand why I was showing him the very paperwork he had used to financially exile me. I folded my hands together and rested them on the table, leaning forward slightly to ensure he heard every single syllable of his destruction. I kept my voice perfectly level optimized for maximum psychological impact. I told him, "You signed the divorce papers, Richard. You stood in front of 24 witnesses in my dining room, and you legally severed yourself from my assets to protect your imaginary wealth. You demanded exclusive ownership of the house and your stock options while forcing me to retain sole, independent ownership of my supposedly worthless consulting business." I paused, letting the echo of my words bounce off the glass walls. Then I delivered the viral receipt that would permanently end his life. I told him that means you formally and legally severed yourself from the 82% controlling stake I hold in Apex Capital. Richard physically recoiled as if I had just struck him across the face. He blinked rapidly, staring at the signed legal document and then staring back at me. He shook his head slowly, muttering the word "no" under his breath, over and over again. He could not intellectually bridge the gap between the small limited liability company he thought I ran and the $9 billion private equity ghost firm that had just silently acquired his entire commercial real estate conglomerate. I did not give him a single second to recover. I maintained total eye contact and continued driving the financial stake directly through his heart. I explained that Apex Capital was not a local bookkeeping service for bakeries. It was a massive shadow acquisition firm that I founded 8 years ago using my extensive federal forensic accounting experience. I told him I had actively acquired Vanguard Real Estate last Wednesday, completely absorbing his entire corporate structure while he was busy picking out custom catering menus and expensive champagne for his pathetic celebration. I told him to turn to the second page in the dossier. He obeyed blindly, his hands trembling so severely he almost tore the thick paper. The second document was a certified federal banking registry explicitly detailing the corporate ownership structure of Horizon Trust. I watched his eyes track across the page until he hit the highlighted paragraph in the center. I told him the bank you deliberately targeted for your massive embezzlement scheme was silently purchased by Apex Capital exactly 6 months ago. I told him you spent weeks searching for a financially vulnerable institution to process your forged $4.2 million commercial equity line, completely unaware that you were actively targeting my own personal banking servers. You thought you were slipping your massive felony right past a sleepy regional compliance department. You did not know that every single automated fraud alert, every single wire routing confirmation, and every single geographical expenditure trace on that platinum credit card reported directly to my encrypted terminal in our home office. Richard let out a horrific gasping sound, completely unable to draw enough oxygen into his lungs. He was practically sliding out of the expensive leather chair, his body entirely defeated by the crushing mathematical weight of my trap. I kept my tone entirely clinical, stripping away any trace of marital emotion. I told him that if he had simply asked for a divorce, I would have handed him half of our legitimate marital assets and walked away without a second thought. I would have let him live his pathetic, shallow life with his 26-year-old marketing director. But he had to prove his absolute superiority. He had to forge my legal signature. He had to actively attempt to bankrupt my company. He had to invite his mistress into my home and publicly humiliate me in front of his arrogant mother and his sycophantic colleagues. He had actively chosen to cross the line from a common cheating husband to a federal corporate criminal. I leaned back in the chief executive officer's chair, perfectly comfortable in my absolute dominance. I delivered the final devastating clarification of his legal standing. I told him that because he forced me to sign those divorce papers on Friday night, our financial estates were completely separated 12 hours before his $4.2 million fraudulent wire transfer officially cleared the banking system. I told him you did not steal from your wife, Richard. You stole from a federally insured financial institution completely owned by an independent private equity firm. You committed massive interstate wire fraud, digital identity theft, and corporate embezzlement against a federal entity. You completely insulated my wealth from your crimes, and you permanently locked yourself inside a federal prison cell. He buried his face in his hands, letting out a loud, pathetic sob that echoed through the quiet boardroom. The brilliant, wealthy vice president was completely gone, reduced to a weeping, terrified shell of a man. He pleaded with me, his voice muffled through his shaking fingers. He begged me to stop the federal investigation. He swore he would return every single dollar and sign over all of his future earnings to me if I just deleted the digital evidence. He blamed his mother for raising him to be arrogant. He blamed his corporate colleagues for encouraging his aggressive financial strategies. And exactly as I had predicted, he viciously blamed Lexi. He looked up at me with tears streaming down his face and desperately claimed that Lexi was the criminal mastermind who had secretly accessed his computer to forge the documents. He offered to testify against her in federal court to save himself. I looked at him with absolute unyielding disgust. I told him Lexi abandoned him the exact second her customized platinum credit card was declined by the ride-sharing application on Friday night. I told him we had actively tracked her spending through a geographical expenditure algorithm and that she had already surrendered all of the expensive diamond jewelry and the luxury handbags to the federal authorities early Sunday morning in exchange for full legal immunity. She had officially turned state's evidence against him, handing over every single text message and physical receipt proving his sole complicity in the embezzlement scheme. He was completely alone. His mother was currently facing a massive civil lawsuit for the unpaid $2 million catering bill. His tech colleagues had completely blacklisted him from the commercial real estate industry. His mistress had traded his freedom for her own legal survival. And his completely underestimated wife had just legally executed his total financial annihilation. Jasmine stood up from her chair, breaking the long, heavy silence. She walked over to the thick glass windows and looked down at the rainy Seattle streets far below. She did not look at Richard when she spoke. She simply announced that the federal agents from the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network had officially entered the lobby of the Vanguard building. She stated that they possessed a sealed grand jury indictment containing 24 separate counts of felony fraud. I closed the slim black dossier, resting on the mahogany table, and smoothly stood up from the chief executive officer's chair. I buttoned my pristine white blazer and looked down at the completely broken man, sobbing at the other end of the long polished table. I did not offer him a final word of sympathy or a dramatic emotional farewell. I simply checked the time on my diamond watch, noting the exact minute of his total, absolute destruction. The trap had executed flawlessly, and the apex predator had consumed her prey without leaving a single scrap behind. Richard's legs finally gave out completely, unable to support the massive crushing weight of his newly established reality. The expensive custom-tailored Italian trousers hit the hardwood floor of the executive boardroom with a heavy, pathetic thud. The man who had spent 10 entire years demanding absolute obedience and projecting an impenetrable aura of supreme corporate dominance was now literally crawling on his hands and knees. He dragged his body across the expensive imported carpet until he was practically at the base of my heavy leather chair. He reached out with trembling, sweating hands and desperately grabbed the hem of my perfectly tailored charcoal trousers. I did not pull my leg away. I did not flinch or show any sign of physical disgust. I simply looked down at him with the cold clinical fascination of a forensic auditor observing a thoroughly dismantled shell company. Tears were streaming freely down his flushed face, completely ruining his meticulously groomed appearance. Saliva gathered at the corners of his mouth as he babbled a stream of incoherent, frantic apologies. He completely abandoned any remaining shred of his masculine pride and his toxic ego. He begged me for absolute mercy with a voice so high and broken, he sounded completely unrecognizable. He swore he would immediately sign over every single financial asset he had ever accumulated in his entire life. He promised to publicly humiliate himself in front of his arrogant mother, his entire family, and all of his corporate colleagues if I would just call off the federal dogs. He offered to work as an entry-level assistant for my company for the rest of his natural life, just to slowly pay back the money he tried to steal. When he realized my expression was not softening and his frantic promises were bouncing harmlessly off my stoic facade, he immediately resorted to his default defensive maneuver. He aggressively shifted the blame to a woman. He looked up at me with wild, bloodshot eyes and screamed that Lexi had manipulated his entire mind. He claimed the 26-year-old marketing director was a deeply calculating criminal mastermind who had deliberately intoxicated him, seduced him, and forced him to sign those fraudulent lending documents against his own free will. He swore on his own life that he never actually wanted to leave me or file those divorce papers. He called her a vicious parasite and a corporate spy planted by a rival commercial real estate firm to completely destroy his flawless career. He desperately promised to testify against her in federal court and help the government lock her away for decades if I would just grant him corporate immunity. He was actively trying to sell the young woman he claimed to love and protect just 48 hours ago for a single ounce of my financial mercy. He painted himself as a tragically naive victim, completely ignoring the fact that his own signature, his own passwords, and his own voice on the hidden video recording absolutely proved his malicious intent. I did not blink. I did not shift my immaculate posture or offer a single word of emotional validation to his pathetic performance. His frantic groveling was nothing more than meaningless white noise, echoing against the massive steel walls of my financial fortress. He was a bug, caught perfectly in a web of his own design, desperately thrashing against threads that only pulled tighter with every single movement. I slowly lifted my left arm and smoothly pushed back the crisp white cuff of my tailored blazer. I looked down at the heavy diamond watch strapped to my wrist. The second hand swept across the polished face with absolute mathematical precision, entirely indifferent to his suffering. I let the absolute silence stretch across the large boardroom for another 10 agonizing seconds, ensuring he felt the crushing weight of every single passing moment. I looked back down at his tear-stained, pathetic face and delivered my final directive. I kept my voice perfectly level, stripping away any remaining trace of human empathy or marital history. I stated my command with the chilling authority of an absolute victor. I told him the Federal Bureau of Investigation is currently standing in the downstairs lobby. You have exactly 3 minutes to gather your personal items. The specific words hit him like a physical blow to his chest. He abruptly let go of my trousers and slumped entirely flat against the carpet, his body convulsing with heavy, wet sobs. He did not stand up to gather his expensive leather briefcase, his custom-engraved pens, or the framed photographs from his corner office. He mentally realized those luxury items no longer belonged to him. They were now the legal corporate property of Apex Capital, seized to offset the massive financial damage he had attempted to inflict. He simply laid there on the floor of the boardroom he used to rule, completely paralyzed by the overwhelming terror of his impending incarceration. He buried his face into the carpet, weeping for the loss of his imaginary wealth and his shattered reputation. Exactly 3 minutes later, the heavy brass handles of the boardroom doors turned for the final time. 2 heavily armed federal agents walked into the room wearing dark windbreakers with the bright yellow letters of their agency printed boldly across their backs. They moved with the swift, uncompromising efficiency of seasoned law enforcement officers, executing a high-profile white-collar warrant. They did not knock. They did not ask for permission to enter the restricted executive space. Jasmine had already granted them full, unlimited legal access to the entire Vanguard building. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a completely stoic expression, walked directly over to where Richard was still shivering violently on the floor. The agent loudly instructed Richard to stand up and place his hands securely behind his back. When Richard failed to comply, his body entirely locked in a state of catatonic shock. The 2 agents simply reached down, grabbed him by the fabric of his expensive Italian suit, and forcefully hauled him to his feet. They spun him around and slammed him face first against the polished mahogany table. The sharp metallic clicking sound of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists echoed brilliantly through the quiet boardroom. It was the absolute sweetest symphony I had heard in 10 years. The lead agent leaned closely into Richard's ear and loudly recited the Miranda rights reading directly from a printed federal warrant. The agent explicitly stated that Richard was being placed under immediate federal arrest for multiple counts of aggravated wire fraud, digital identity theft, and the deliberate forgery of commercial lending documents totaling $4.2 million. Richard did not fight back. He did not scream or loudly demand his expensive corporate lawyers like he had done on the phone Friday night. He simply let his head hang down, staring blankly at the polished wood as the agents forcefully marched him away from the table. They escorted him out of the boardroom, leading him down the main corporate hallway so every single one of his former employees could witness the absolute destruction of his arrogant empire. He was paraded past the junior executives he used to torment, past the glass conference rooms he used to command, and directly into the waiting elevator. While Richard was taking his final, humiliating walk toward the waiting federal transport vehicles, Jasmine stepped out of the boardroom to handle the last remaining piece of the fraudulent puzzle. Lexi had foolishly returned to the Vanguard real estate offices that morning, desperately hoping to quietly pack her desk and sneak out of the building before the Human Resources Department noticed her missing. She was frantically shoving her expensive desk accessories, her designer makeup, and her framed marketing degrees into a brown cardboard box when Jasmine completely blocked the doorway of her small office. Lexi froze her eyes, widening in sheer panic as she instantly recognized the brilliant African-American woman from the Mercer Island dinner party. Jasmine did not enter the room. She stood perfectly straight in her $4,000 Tom Ford suit, projecting absolute unyielding corporate dominance. She looked down at the terrified 26-year-old who had arrogantly dropped a platinum credit card on my kitchen floor just days ago. Jasmine delivered the final termination order with surgical precision. She informed Lexi that her employment with Vanguard Real Estate was immediately and permanently terminated. She stated that because Lexi had already surrendered to the federal authorities and turned state evidence, she would temporarily avoid a lengthy federal prison sentence. But her corporate career in this city was entirely obliterated. Jasmine calmly explained that her entire severance package was completely voided due to gross corporate misconduct and active knowing participation in a massive federal embezzlement scheme. Lexi began to cry, offering pathetic, hollow apologies and claiming she was simply manipulated and pressured by an older, powerful executive. She tried to play the victim, entirely forgetting how proudly she had flaunted her stolen wealth. Jasmine completely ignored her crocodile tears. She raised a small digital security remote and pressed a single button. The digital lock on Lexi's office door instantly flashed red, indicating her keycard was permanently disabled across the entire Vanguard network. Jasmine coldly instructed her to pick up her cardboard box and walk directly to the service elevator. She told Lexi her corporate access was entirely revoked, and if she ever stepped foot on any property owned by Apex Capital or its subsidiaries, she would be immediately arrested and aggressively prosecuted for criminal trespassing. Lexi picked up her pathetic brown box, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped her belongings onto the floor. She walked down the hallway, her expensive high heels dragging against the carpet, completely stripped of her arrogant smirk and her stolen offshore dreams. Jasmine watched her disappear behind the closing metal doors of the service elevator, perfectly ensuring she never reached the main lobby to cause a scene. The corporate building was officially cleansed of their toxic presence, and the entire commercial empire was now safely resting in our complete control. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom clicked shut behind the federal agents, leaving me alone in the massive executive suite. The suffocating tension instantly dissolved, replaced by the crisp, clean silence of absolute victory. I did not smile. I simply stood up from the heavy leather chair and reached down to smooth out the front of my tailored white blazer. My hands were perfectly steady. My breathing was completely calm. I looked down at the polished mahogany table where Richard had aggressively demanded my absolute submission just a few days prior. The only physical evidence that he had ever existed was the small damp patch on the expensive carpet where his tears had fallen. He was completely erased from the corporate narrative by his own monumental arrogance. I picked up the slim black dossier containing his signed divorce papers and tucked it securely under my left arm. It was no longer a weapon, but simply a completed business transaction. I turned on my black leather stiletto heels and walked toward the exit. I stepped out of the boardroom and into the main executive hallway. The 50th floor was in a state of chaotic shock. Junior vice presidents were frantically whispering in small clusters, and administrative assistants were staring blankly at their computer screens, attempting to process the sudden violent removal of their untouchable leader. None of them dared to make eye contact with me as I walked past their glass cubicles. They parted like the Red Sea, stepping aside to let the true owner of their commercial empire pass through. I moved with the unbothered grace of a woman who had just successfully executed the most lucrative hostile takeover of her career. I reached the end of the hallway and pressed the silver call button for the executive elevator. The polished steel door slid open and I stepped inside the empty car. As the elevator began its rapid descent, I felt a lightness wash over my body. The suffocating dead weight I had been carrying for the past 10 years was finally gone. I was no longer forced to shrink myself to fit inside the fragile boundaries of his massive narcissistic ego. I was no longer required to play the role of the quiet, oblivious bookkeeper while he paraded his stolen wealth and his young mistresses around the city. I was completely free. The elevator chimed softly as it reached the main lobby. I walked past the security desk where the guard who had denied Richard access gave me a crisp, respectful nod. I pushed through the heavy glass revolving doors and stepped out into the rainy Seattle morning. I opened my black umbrella and crossed the busy downtown street, moving seamlessly through the sea of corporate commuters. Directly across from the Vanguard headquarters was a coffee shop favored by the local financial elite. I pulled open the heavy wooden door, and the rich scent of freshly roasted espresso beans replaced the sterile corporate smell of the boardroom. I scanned the room and immediately spotted Jasmine sitting in a quiet corner booth near the back window. She had shed the executioner persona she wore upstairs and was now sitting comfortably with her legs crossed, reading a digital tablet and sipping a dark roast coffee. When she saw me approaching, she offered a smile that actually reached her eyes. I slid into the leather booth across from her and placed my black dossier on the wooden table. A barista brought over my standard order, a double espresso. Jasmine took a slow sip of her coffee and locked her device. She did not ask me how I was feeling or if I was emotionally devastated by watching my husband get dragged away in federal handcuffs. She knew me far too well for those pleasantries. She leaned forward and transitioned back into her role as the counsel for Apex Capital. She tapped the screen of her tablet, pulling up the finalized asset liquidation reports. She told me the Federal Financial Crimes Enforcement Network had frozen the $4.2 million fraudulent wire transfer and returned the capital directly to our holding accounts. The money he thought he had stolen was already sitting safely back in my digital vault, generating passive interest. Jasmine swiped to the next digital document. She confirmed the Mercer Island property was now legally registered under a completely anonymous blind trust controlled entirely by our private equity firm. The massive $3 million house where he publicly humiliated me was now just another lucrative piece of real estate in my commercial portfolio. She also confirmed that all of his Vanguard stock options had been permanently seized and liquidated to cover the legal penalties associated with his corporate fraud. He owned absolutely nothing. His checking accounts, his high-yield savings, and his offshore tax havens were zeroed out by the authorities. Jasmine smiled softly and told me the only physical assets he possessed were the cheap wrinkled clothes he was wearing when the agents threw him into their transport vehicle. I took a sip of my espresso, letting the bitter taste ground me in the present moment. I looked out the large glass window, watching the busy Seattle traffic move steadily through the relentless rain. I felt absolutely no guilt and no lingering sadness. I had not destroyed Richard. I had simply held up a mirror and allowed his own towering arrogance to completely consume him. He spent a decade desperately trying to prove he was the smartest man in the room, entirely blind to the fact that I actually owned the entire building. I placed my ceramic espresso cup back onto the matching saucer with a soft, satisfying click. I was richer, free, and unfazed by the dramatic events of the morning. I looked across the table at Jasmine and offered her a razor-sharp smile. The trap had worked flawlessly. The toxic waste was successfully removed from my life, and the trash had literally taken itself out. There is a fundamental flaw in the psychology of extremely arrogant men like Richard. They constantly mistake a woman's total silence for blind compliance, and they deeply confuse basic kindness with inherent weakness. They spend their entire lives aggressively building massive financial empires, literally standing on our backs to reach the absolute highest corporate floors. They decorate their fragile glass castles with stolen wealth and unchecked pride, completely forgetting one critical, undeniable detail. We are the ones who actually built the structural foundation. We are the ones who quietly managed the complex spreadsheets, organized the encrypted files, and meticulously observed every single corporate transaction. We know exactly where all the load-bearing walls are permanently hidden. They become so deeply intoxicated by their own perceived brilliance that they completely stop paying attention to the quiet, stoic women standing directly in their shadows. They honestly think they can simply replace us with a much younger model or casually discard us with a pathetic financial settlement, check the exact moment they feel sufficiently powerful. But true absolute power does not ever need to scream or boast in a crowded formal dining room. True power does not need to illegally forge guarantor signatures or maliciously manipulate young employees to get exactly what it wants. True power sits perfectly still at the far end of the walnut table, simply watching the narcissist frantically dig his own catastrophic grave. All it takes is the highly calculated strategic removal of one single structural brick. You do not need to violently burn the entire corporate house down with your own two hands. You simply pull that one critical load-bearing brick and calmly watch the entire spectacular illusion crumble into absolute worthless dust. Richard truly thought he was the brilliant architect of my total domestic destruction, but he was absolutely nothing more than a temporary, ungrateful tenant in a massive financial fortress that I completely owned and controlled. He aggressively demanded his absolute freedom from our marriage, and I legally gave him exactly what he asked for. Have you ever had a front row seat to watch a massive narcissist blindly dig their own ultimate financial grave? There is absolutely nothing more deeply satisfying than watching a man completely destroy his own life using the exact same weapons he forged to hurt you. If you loved seeing Richard's towering arrogance permanently cost him his corporate career and his physical freedom, you need to hit that like button right now. My absolute favorite moment of this entire journey was when Jasmine confidently walked into that executive boardroom and dropped her gold-embossed general counsel card directly onto his mahogany desk, completely shattering his racist and sexist delusions in a single second. I want to know what your absolute favorite moment of the story was. Did you love the 60-second digital delay at the dinner party, or the look on his face when the bank called? Drop your favorite scene in the comments below so we can celebrate this massive victory together. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell for more incredible stories of ultimate undeniable justice.